Hello, everyone, and welcome to Democracy and Tyranny. My name is Donald Robertson, and I'll be hosting the event today on behalf of the Plato's Academy Centre non-profit organisation. I want to begin by saying a special thank you to Jeff, our producer, and Casey, our communications director, who are here assisting me. And here they are. Say hi.
Hello.
So I'm going to begin by doing a little bit of quick housekeeping. Although it's a live stream, remember you can pause if you need to take a break, and the recording will be available to everyone within a few days. Each presentation today will last around about 20-25 minutes. Please keep your comments in the chat polite and focus on encouraging civil discourse. Even though we're talking about politics, practice tolerance of disagreement. Please do post your questions for our speakers. There will be a panel discussion lasting around about 30 minutes towards the end of the event for your questions. We won't be taking questions after individual presentations to manage the time better, but we will be presenting a selection of them to the panel. Please remember that Plato's Academy Centre is a non-profit, and although all of these events are free of charge, we can only do them through your generosity. So please consider donating, whether it's $1 or $100, to support our work if you've not done so already. If you would like to donate, you may do so at the link, which I think is going to appear at the bottom of your screen or in the chat. You can also support Plato's Academy Centre by following or subscribing to our newsletter on Substack, where and we'll share that link as well. There's loads of really good content that we put out there, which is generously provided by some of the publishers that we work with. Plato's Academy Centre is committed to promoting ancient philosophy in a way that's relevant to modern life. In addition to online events and sharing original content through our newsletter, we're working in the longer term towards setting up a permanent base beside the original location of Plato's Academy at Academia Platonos in Athens. We've already hosted a variety of events and meetups there in person, as well as doing the online stuff. We've almost 1,000 people attending this event today, either live or catching up with the recording if they're in another time zone, as they come from all over the world. For example, here are the top 10 countries you're all watching from in rank order: the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, Greece, South Africa, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Ireland. I'm glad to see more and more people from Greece attending our events. I believe many of us in recent decades in different countries have observed the gradual erosion of democratic values, a deepening of political division and polarization, the gradual collapse of civil discourse about politics, growing intolerance of disagreement, and a rising acceptance of political tyranny, otherwise known as authoritarianism. We've also witnessed the growing influence of information technology on our society, from social media to artificial intelligence, and perhaps wondered about their impact on the future of democracy. In this event, we turn to history, philosophy, and political thought to understand how democracies falter and how they endure. Over the next few hours, we'll hear from leading experts about the lessons from ancient Greek history that we could learn. Athens was the birthplace of democracy. Athenian history shows us how democracy initially flourished alongside philosophy and freedom of speech, but also how the inherent weaknesses of the democratic system were soon exploited to the maximum by sophists and demagogues who carefully studied how political rhetoric could be used to manipulate public opinion. Something that led to deepening political division and the eventual collapse of the Athenian democracy during the dictatorship of the 30 tyrants. The words of ancient thinkers who wrestled with the problems of justice, democracy, and tyranny, such as Socrates, Plato, Plutarch, the Stoics, and others, therefore seem increasingly relevant to many of us today. Today's conference isn't just an academic exercise, it's a call to reflection and action. How do we judge the health of our society or diagnose its ailments? What does effective resistance to tyranny look like in this day and age? And how do we cultivate the courage needed to sustain democratic ideals? So think about these questions as you're listening to the talks, and post your questions in the chat, which we can present to our panel at the end of the event today. Our first speaker will help us to address some of these questions. Diane Kaelin-Sukra is an expert on the cultural foundations of democracy. She's the host of the Cultivating Civility podcast and author of Save Your City: How Toxic Culture Kills Community and What to Do About It. Her presentation titled Diagnosing Civic Culture, examines how trust, empathy, and civic engagement either strengthen or erode democratic institutions. Diane Kaelin Sukra.
I'd like to begin by thanking Donald Robertson for the gracious invitation to speak again at Plato's Academy. It's always an honor to be part of this vital project to revive this ancient academy as a living forum for the kind of wisdom that we urgently need today. Thank you also for hosting this gathering, a rare opportunity to reflect on and recover not only the philosophical insights of the ancients, but the practical tools that they gave us for understanding civic life and confronting democratic backsliding, as well as the rise of authoritarianism, what they rightly call tyranny. This ancient wisdom, of course, was never meant to be locked in ivory towers. It was meant to guide life in the polis, in the city, in our communities, to cultivate discernment, ethical judgment, and the moral habits and skills of citizenship and civic leadership. And one of those skills, nearly lost and urgently needed, is the ability to diagnose civic culture and ultimately to take steps to repair it. And it is this skill that is the focus of my talk today. In modern political life, we most often measure success by the visible machinery of governance, balanced budgets, delivered services, enacted laws and bylaws. But the ancients would have emphasized different metrics because they asked different questions than the ones that we ask today, such as, what is the character of those who govern? What ethical principles guide our common life? What habits of thought and action sustain the polis? Are the hearts and minds of the people just? Are they flourishing? These questions are almost entirely absent from our mainstream thinking, as well as the education and training of civic leaders and citizens. And that absence has left us ill-equipped to recognize the seriousness of the slow but steady deterioration of our political culture, which has taken place over a generation and is now threatening our institutions and democracy itself. Not only have we struggled to see the problem clearly, we've lacked the language, the framework, and the courage to name it, let alone address the rising incivility and authoritarianism all around us. But now is as good a time as any to explore some of the practical wisdom that the ancients have left us with, but we have yet to fully remember or heed. I experienced this disconnect firsthand in the trenches of civic life, where I've spent decades working alongside elected officials, public servants, and communities struggling to govern well under growing financial, political, and social pressure. Across Western democracies, the number of municipalities facing governance dysfunction, paralysis, or outright collapse is growing. Within the next 5 years, local government associations in the UK warn that around 40% of councils could face bankruptcy, joining iconic cities like Birmingham and Nottingham, which have already effectively declared insolvency. In Australia, over 100 municipalities have been dissolved, suspended, or forcibly amalgamated due to financial or leadership crises. Similar patterns are emerging in the United States and Canada. The signs are familiar and increasingly widespread and include things like challenges in producing audited financial statements, mass staff turnover, often with entire teams either quitting or being forced out, failures to meet even the most basic statutory requirements for services like water, sewer, or even public record keeping. All while a tsunami of pressures, rising homelessness, the opioid crisis, crumbling infrastructure, and accelerating environmental threats bear down on already strained systems. As a city manager, I once inherited a municipality in precisely this state. The organization was broken at every level. But through an election that produced the political will and determined effort, we were able to restore order. And in the course of a term, we engineered a dramatic turnaround. Yet, as we rebuilt, it became clear that beneath each operational failure lay a deeper fracture, a heart problem, a cultural problem. The dysfunction originated not in systems or processes alone, but in the habits, relationships, and moral atmosphere of the institution and the community itself. And unless that culture was confronted and renewed, every effort at repair would be like Sisyphus pushing the boulder uphill only to watch it roll back down again. The same is true across civic life in both urban and rural municipalities. And long before we saw governance paralyzed or institutions destabilized, the warning signs were there. We saw rising bullying in schools and in toxic workplaces, growing incivility in public life, increasing anger, ill will, loneliness, and despair. They were treated as isolated incidents or temporary trends, when they were signs of a deeper disorder in how we relate to one another, in how we deliberate, in how we exercise responsibility and restraint. And we should have recognized them for what they were. They were the early symptoms, red flags of a civic culture in decline. And yet, I struggle to persuade my colleagues and our local government associations to see them in this way. I warned that something deeper was unfolding beyond bad apples, policy disagreements, or communications breakdowns. That rising incivility in public life wasn't just unpleasant and inconvenient, it was unjust. It was eroding the very conditions that make democratic self-governance possible. And it wasn't going to be fixed with a one-off governance workshop or a wellness retreat or even anti-harassment training, even a new code of conduct. We needed to take civic culture seriously within institutions and in our communities in an intentional and sustained way. But again and again, I got the same response. You can't change civic culture, I was told. It was treated as intangible, unmeasurable, outside the scope of governance or leadership. And that, I've come to believe, is one of the most dangerous blind spots of our time. It's a blind spot that we might have avoided had we remembered to look at governance and civil society through Plato's eyes. In the Republic, he taught that political regimes do not simply fall through external disruption. They decay through internal erosion. He essentially argues through Socrates that the city is what it is because the people are what they are. And that explained why certain communities functioned and even thrived when others unraveled, even with identical laws, structures, and external challenges. It was never just about governance procedures. It was about how we inhabit our institutions, who we are when we enter them, and what we bring to the shared life that they require. In other words, there is no good and wise governance without good and wise people. Plato went further. He traced the descent from what he describes as the just, well-ordered soul to the unjust, tyrannical one as a moral and psychological progression. His descriptions feel unnervingly familiar. The tyrannical man, the authoritarian, Socrates tells us, is not only addicted to power and ruled by appetite, he's disloyal to friends and closest kin alike. And he will do any horrible deed, driven by a disordered soul that has lost all restraint. This tyrannical soul, he tells us 2,400 years ago, is one who purges all who are courageous, great-spirited, and wise, until he is left alone with flatterers and parasites. Have we not all witnessed the systemic purging of wisdom, courage, and even vision from our organizations, institutions, and public life? Is this not what we're alluding to when we ask, where have all the authentic leaders gone? So yes, these are behaviors we recognize in leaders, institutions, and sometimes even ourselves. Plato advises us that when such unjust souls dominate public life, the civic atmosphere deteriorates. Stewardship gives way to self-interest. Leadership becomes more about manipulation and power than service. Reputations are dismantled through whisper campaigns and half-truths, and gossip becomes currency. Ill will, once confined to the margins and even criminal elements of society, seeps into the mainstream, normalizing contempt, cruelty, punishing dissent, and corroding trust. Solidarity, where it exists, is between the gang and not motivated toward the common good. So what does this look like today in our communities, in our local governments? People weaponizing bylaws and local processes to punish and humiliate their neighbors. It's citizens inflamed by grievance or misinformation, showing up not to contribute or resolve, but to blame, shame, and take down. It's council members using rules of order to settle personal scores or silence opposition. It's staff operating in a climate of fear, torn between ethical duty and job survival. It's trusted professionals being sidelined or scapegoated for political gain. It's dialogue giving way to shouting matches, wisdom being drowned out by performance. Its public meetings becoming theater staged for social media, not truth or problem solving. Its online forums and comment sections fueling division, spreading gossip faster than facts. And its acts of good faith being met with suspicion and restraint being mistaken for weakness. What begins as dysfunction eventually hardens into a culture of intimidation, where public service becomes a daily exercise in endurance, and no one escapes untouched. In the end, the community suffers with poor governance, reduced service delivery, and a breakdown in communal trust and care. By 2018, I was so concerned and frustrated that we were simply letting this happen that I chose to leave my role as a city manager to sound the alarm more broadly. I wanted people to see what I was seeing because of my classical education, that our local governments, once training grounds for democracies, were being hollowed out by moral confusion, unchecked incivility, and a deep forgetting of what holds a civic community together. To that end, I wrote Save Your City, How Toxic Culture Kills Community and What to Do About It, a resource for civic leaders and citizens ready to name what's happening and take action. The book leads readers on a journey from the hypothetical Bullyville, where too many live, work, and play today, which is essentially a community governed by Plato's tyrannical souls, through the wisdom of classical antiquity to Sustainaville, where just souls shape civic life and loving one's neighbor is a virtue. The civility tour that ensued continues to this day because incivility, once unleashed, spreads like a contagion unless it's intentionally and consistently countered. At the same time, I founded Kalin Academy to equip local leaders with the timeless civic wisdom and practical tools they were never taught, but we clearly urgently need. And what I was reaching for, and what I invite us to recover today, is an ancient tradition that began in Plato's Academy and continues at this revived academy in this gathering here today. Not one that reacts only when the house is on fire, but one that trains us to recognize the early signs of civic decay and respond with discernment, courage, and consistency towards civic culture renewal. Plato founded the academy to prepare leaders with the wisdom to tend to the fragile garden of community. He knew what happens when incivility and authoritarian might is right impulses overtake reason and civil discourse. The city he loved turned on Socrates, his teacher, and Athens' conscience, the living embodiment of the just soul, and condemned him to death on false charges. It was civic scapegoating at its worst, a kind of ancient cancel culture. For Plato, the trial was a civic failure, not just a legal one, and it sparked his mission to shape a different kind of leader and a different kind of citizen capable of sustaining a just society. Aristotle, his student, carried the tradition forward, arguing that politics at its core is ethics scaled to the level of the city, our shared character in action. Centuries later, Tocqueville warned that democracy depends not only on laws and structure, but on the quality of our shared life, the mores, customs, and habits of the heart that sustain the common good. Had we stayed closer to this tradition, we might not have been so bewildered and caught off guard by our current crisis. We wouldn't be asking, like so many, suddenly confronted by the rise of authoritarianism, how did this happen? We would have seen it long ago and worked together to turn the cultural tide. Instead, we tried for too long to deny the severity of the cultural crisis. We denied our agency in changing it, and then we tried to legislate civility and force civility. Some have advocated for reversing course and fighting fire with fire, hostility with hostility. But we've avoided the deeper questions. How do we diagnose civic culture? And then how do we renew it? And these are the questions I invite us to carry through this gathering on democracy and tyranny. Now let's take a deeper look at the civic culture diagnostic tool that Plato embedded in the Republic. His method is grounded in one of the most enduring insights in political thought, that the city is the soul writ large, a mirror of the character of its citizens. So if you want to know where a city or regime is headed, Plato tells us, don't start with its structures, start with its character, the soul of the people. What do they admire? What do they pursue? Whom do they elevate? What do they tolerate or fail to question? And these questions help to reveal the kind of souls that dominate public life, and with them, the direction of the regime itself. Plato identifies 5 distinct soul types, like civic archetypes, that serve as a diagnostic lens. Each one reflects a moral orientation, maps onto a form of government, and shows up in citizens, leaders, and institutions alike. These types are not theoretical. They appear every day at board tables, in council chambers, in schools, workplaces, and across public life, just as they do in the Republic, where Socrates' dialogue partners each embody one of the soul types. So let's walk through them, reminding ourselves that who we are and how we show up shapes the soul of the city itself and matters more than we realize. First, there is the just leader. This is the aristocratic soul, governed by reason and virtue. Plato calls this person aristos, meaning the best. Not in social class or in wealth, as our modern understanding of an aristocrat may suggest, but in excellence of character. The just leader seeks to govern themselves before governing others. They love truth more than approval, and the common good more than private gain. They're quiet stewards, servant leaders, not headline makers, and though they rarely seek power, they are the ones that we wish held it. Then there's the honor seeker. This timocratic soul is guided by pride and discipline. They value duty and order, but they're vulnerable to vanity. They easily mistake deference for dignity, and they're inflated by flattery and hardened by criticism. Civic life suffers when they are harsh towards inferiors, deferential to superiors, and prize loyalty over truth, the champion procedural rigidity and silence dissent. The result is order without justice and structure without trust. Then there's the wealth preserver. This oligarchic soul is cautious and calculating, driven by fear of loss more than pursuit of excellence. They discipline their desires, but only to protect their wealth and position. For them, politics is about securing advantage. When such souls dominate civic life, governance becomes transactional. Equity erodes, impartiality gives way to favoritism. Public decisions serve those with influence, not those with need, who are instead subjected to constant austerity. Then there's the pleasure seeker. This is the democratic soul, restless and allergic to limits. They exalt freedom, but confuse it with indulgence. They honor all desires equally and struggle to differentiate between impulse and principle. In civic life, this person resists structure, elevates preference over purpose, and demands rights without responsibilities. They live for the moment and resent accountability. The result is a society of conflicting freedoms and eroding social bonds. And finally, the despot in waiting. This is the tyrannical soul, emerging from democracy gone wild. This person begins as a liberator and ends as an oppressor. They silence dissent, elevate loyalty over truth, and govern not through principle, but through appetite. Plato warns that such figures are not simply corrupt, they're enslaved to their own compulsions. When too many tyrannical souls gain prominence in a society, reflected in the rise of narcissistic traits in leadership and human relationships, it signals that civic degradation is already underway, and democratic decline is no longer a distant threat, but a present reality. We experience it in the erosion of civic decency, the normalization of incivility, cruelty, and coercion. Polybius, the Greek historian and political thinker writing in the 2nd century BCE, echoes this warning in the Histories, where he traced democratic regime decay to the moral deterioration of its people. In the final phase, what he calls mob rule, ochlocracia, accountability disappears and leaders reflect the disordered passions of the crowd. His description is disturbingly familiar. He says that people are violent, bold, unscrupulous, always ready with abuse, and often misled by passions. And he warns that the people become susceptible to demagogues who exploit their passions and lead them further away from reasoned governance. It sounds less like history and more like a diagnosis of our time. Public servants across communities today describe encountering these very dynamics: leaders unchecked by principle, mobs emboldened by grievance, and institutions strained by chaos. The brilliance of Plato's method lies not only in theory, but in the dialogue. He doesn't simply describe these soul types. He has Socrates engaging with them in the public square, just as we can and must. Through these exchanges, Plato offers us a way of discerning the moral fabric of civic life, while engaging others in a way that strengthens it. Iron sharpening iron in pursuit of justice. It's also a reminder that democracy, like any system, is not self-sustaining. It rises or falls with the character of its citizens. So the critical question is not whether these soul types exist, they always will. The question is, which one dominates? Which one do we elect? And which one do we become? Ultimately, how do we cultivate the appetite for wisdom and justice in ourselves and in those we lead? Because as Plato reminds us, and I paraphrase here, there shall be no end to the troubles of cities, nor for humanity, until those who govern are lovers of wisdom, or until philosophers become kings. So to that end, he offers a path forward, regime change through soul change. It may not be the easy way, but it is the lasting one. And that brings us to the great task ahead, a talk perhaps for another day, the renewal of civic culture. This isn't a one-time fix, it's a generational project and includes a revival of civic education, not just in schools, but in councils, communities, and public institutions. It means cultivating the habits of moral reasoning, respectful dialogue, and public-spirited leadership. It means reviving the art of living and working well together. And that, in many ways, is the legacy of Plato's Academy, not a museum of ideas, but a living school for those committed to justice, wise leadership, and the care of the civic soul. If you're ready to take the next step, I invite you to connect with the Civic Wisdom community at kalenacademy.com/newsletter, and you'll receive a complimentary copy of the Roadmap to Renewing Civic Culture, first published in Save Your City. I also encourage you to stay engaged with the vital work of Plato's Academy Center as it honors its ancient founding mission to shape the kind of souls that stand against tyranny and build a just society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Diane Kaelin-Sucre for that thought-provoking presentation on diagnosing civic culture. Next, we turn from diagnosis to remedy. Skippy Mesereau, a practitioner of political healing, host of the Healing Our Politics podcast, and advocate for bridging divides through dialogue. His talk, Arete or Apathy, Courage is the Only Way Forward, challenges us to move beyond polarization and reclaim the civic virtues that sustain democracy. In a world that often rewards outrage, Skippy makes the case for courage, not just in grand gestures, but in everyday engagement. Skippy Mesereau.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for having me here, Donald. Diane, that was beautiful. When I served in elected office, I worked with an assistant city manager named Diane, who was a bright spot in a culture that resembled a lot of what you talked about. So thank you for leading off that way. Before a tyrant ever arises in the world, one rises inside of us. The one who whispers, play small, stay safe, let someone else handle it. We imagine tyranny as a force outside of us, armies, strong men, collapsing institutions, but that's not how democracy dies. Democracy dies when citizens forget they matter, not with a bang, but with a scroll. We think we're opting out, protecting our energy, and yes, there's merit to that, but every act of prolonged opt-out is complicity in the status quo. Plato warned us 2,372 years ago that the heaviest penalty for declining to rule is being ruled by someone inferior to yourself. Plato believed the soul and the state mirrored each other. If we do not govern ourselves, we invite tyranny in both our homes and the halls of power. Edmund Burke echoed this nearly 2 millennia later with the idea that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men and good people to do nothing. But the call to service is not just about preventing evil. The cosmic gift, in my experience, is that when you rise to your calling for others, you find your truest self. That's what Aristotle called arete. In Greek, arete meant more than excellence. It meant moral excellence in action, when one fulfills their unique purpose with virtue. For Aristotle, arete was not a trait, it was a practice, a way of being. It lived not in theory, but in your habits, in your choices, in your courage. It was the flourishing of human life, what he called eudaimonia. And today at the Civic Courage Lab, we understand it as simply your highest embodied potential in service. At the lab, we know the greatest threat to democracy is not political division. We've always had that. It is not political division. We have always had that. It's personal disengagement and the inability to face hard challenges. When you abandon your arete, you abandon us. And when you abandon the collective, you abandon yourself. The call to courage, to doing the hard thing, is not just for the sake of community. It is the key to your joy, your relationships, your purpose, and the meaning of your life itself. If you answer the call to arete, democracy wins, yes, but so do you. We often buy into this myth that leadership lives in high places, elected officials, boardrooms, halls of power, but democracy doesn't just live there. It lives right here in you, in your body, in your next choice. The myth of high places is an excuse. The truth is you are already a leader. We are the most social higher primates on the planet, and everything that we do is contagious, from COVID to kindness. So everything that you do influences others. Every choice you make is a vote for fear or love, safety or service, apathy or arete. Let me tell you a story about my friend and client, Kenny. Kenny White III didn't hold office. He didn't set policy. He ran used car dealerships. And for most of his adult life, he was quietly losing a battle with himself. Despite talent, opportunity, and privilege, Kenny carried a story, a core wound, that he'd never meet his father's expectations, that he'd always let someone down, and that he might not as well try. So he didn't. He numbed. He drank himself into stage 2 liver cirrhosis by his mid-30s, his face red and swollen to the size of his personality. But then came the accident, a playful moment with his 3-year-old daughter. One somersault off the couch and he snapped his neck. And the doctor was clear. No movement from the neck down ever again. And the insurance company agreed, tried to deny him coverage, called him and his case hopeless. But his family didn't. They fought. And they got him into Craig Hospital, one of the best spinal rehab centers in the country. And there, in that rupture, Kenny made a choice to fight, to face the tyrant within. He quit drinking. He returned to spirit. At the Civic Courage Lab, he did the courageous work and looked inward. He faced the self-loathing that was driving his behavior and found self-love to fill that void. He faced the tyrant within. He reclaimed his role as father, and summoning courage, he faced his oldest tyrant and renamed him Dad. And he resolved to make his suffering our healing. And then, from never being able to move his body again, he ran a 5K. And that's not even the miracle. Here's the miracle. He organized over 400 people to join him. The very ambulance that carried him on that fateful day was there. The helicopter that flew him in showed up. He got local news to cover it, and he took over a college stadium to do it. Half of the proceeds went to the neurological department that saved his life, so others without resources could access care. The other half started a scholarship to train new nurses, like the ones who cared for him when he couldn't care for himself. And he is just getting started. Kenny is building a nonprofit to help others walk, run, or roll towards the life they thought they'd lost, to rise to their arete. He left the ease of the bottle for the challenge of leadership, and his life has never been better, despite his new physical limitations. His daughters see it in his eyes every morning. I see it in his eyes every time we talk. No policy can do that. No law, no elected title. At the Civic Courage Lab, we say the challenge is the way. And we know all change happens from the inside out. We can only lead others as far as we've led ourselves. The systems that we live The systems that we live within are not separate from us. They are made of us. We are as much a part of the fabric and functioning of these systems as the cells in our body of our us. And we are often similarly unaware. As was said, the masonry of society is our souls. Let me tell you one more story. Dave Knutson is 72 years old. He built his home by hand. He ski tours on the weekends and cooks food from his garden with his wife of 38 years. His checkered shirts are wrinkled like his face and just as charming. Some believe power lies in title, that if you win a seat, you win the right to change things. But courage isn't guaranteed by an oath of office, and titles don't make leaders. Choices do. Dave Knutson in retirement chose to run and was elected to the town council of Paonia, Colorado, a community of just 1,200 people. A place most overlook where birds pass by without noticing, but democracy doesn't look anyone or anywhere. The town was in trouble. City managers came and went, meetings stretched past midnight full of shouting, accusations, and dysfunction. And Dave bought into it. He was ready to censure a fellow council member, the most extreme act of public rebuke available. And it would have felt good, righteous. But it would have solved nothing. Because the truth is, this kind of public punishment is just performance. A way to look tough without doing the actual hard work to fix what's broken. Prioritizing the perception of me versus the success of we. But Dave made a different choice. He chose to do the harder thing, the courageous thing. He looked inward. He joined a Civic Courage Lab cohort. And there he didn't just study public policy, he studied himself. And he faced the truth that the disrespect he hated in others was mirrored in his own dismissiveness. That his anger at the dysfunction was self-deception, an excuse manufactured by his ego to claim that he was right and someone else had failed the town, to let him off the hook. And it hit him like a punch to the gut. But he knew it was true, and he knew what he had to do. His part. From that humility, he found strength. Instead of censure, he chose conversation. He initiated hard, honest human dialogue with those he judged. He created new techniques, injecting humor into when tensions arose at meetings. He teamed up with the mayor, an ally, quietly agreeing that when things got hot, he'd flash a roll of duct tape out from behind his screen, her cue to breathe instead of burst. 2 years later, no censure, no chaos, a new city manager, a united council advancing a long-term plan, and for the first time in his community's history, affordable housing. Not flashy, not viral, not newsworthy, but powerful, meaningful, and effective. Now there will be children raised in homes made possible by that work, where families grow, where futures root, where democracy lives. Dave didn't just change the tone of a meeting, he changed the trajectory of a town. And few but you will know. But as Harry S. Truman said, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. That's what happens when leaders choose to lead themselves first. And that's the part no one tells us, that when you act with courage, especially when no one's watching, it echoes. Because remember, everything is contagious. Fear is contagious, cynicism is contagious, despair is contagious, but so is courage, so is curiosity, so is integrity, so is love. Every time you choose to listen with curiosity instead of judgment, every time you speak your truth with kindness instead of criticism, every time you show up with integrity, even when it costs you something, you create a new atmosphere around you, one that invites others to rise too. The Stoics believed, and I find daily in our work, that we are all citizens of one shared cosmos. What you heal in yourself, you offer to the whole. You become evidence that a different way is possible, that integrity still exists, that dignity is not dead, that democracy is not a joke, that love is the only thing that really matters. And when one person's arete, your arete, is the only thing that can awaken another. Barack Obama used to say, politicians don't lead the people, they follow. They follow the people. They follow you. And when the people choose disengagement, skillful demagogues fill the void. But when you choose to rise, to do your part, to practice courage in your home, your school, your neighborhood, you don't just change the atmosphere, you change what is politically possible. That's what you're doing. Every time you choose comfort, every time you choose growth over comfort, service over safety, or truth over silence, you lead leaders. We like to believe there's a middle ground. Aristotle taught us that virtue lies in the golden mean, the balance between too little and too much. Courage, he said, is the midpoint between cowardice and recklessness. But choosing comfort over contribution is not neutral. It's cowardice masquerading as self-care. What happens if you don't vote? If you avoid a difficult conversation, if you let your frustration simmer and never say the thing that needs to be said, if you say, well, it's just politics and look away, what changes? What changes? Nothing. And that's the point. Disengagement is not neutrality. There is no neutral. Every moment of silence, every opt-out, every not my business casts a vote. Inaction is an action. If you are waiting for the world to be less chaotic before you contribute, if you're waiting to be less afraid before you speak, if you're waiting to be fully healed before you serve, you will be waiting forever. Democracy isn't asking for your perfection. It's asking for your participation. Arete doesn't require you to be fearless. It requires you to be courageous. It requires you to choose. And remember, there is no courage without fear. Because in the end, there are only two paths: courage or comfort, apathy or arete. So Aristotle asks us, are you ready to do your part? Are you ready to lean in, show up, and do something? And I ask you, are you ready to find out what you're really made of? What you're capable of if you truly try, if you push through and do the hard things? Service, community, and society, these are the ultra endurance sports of life. And there's no opting out. You're all on the trail. Your kids are on the trail. Your loved ones are on the trail. Will you leave it better than you found it? Just a little bit. Will you reach the finish line knowing you fought and played all out? According to Bronnie Ware's famous study, the top 5 regrets of the dying human, based on years spent caring for patients in their final weeks, the number 1 human regret on the deathbed is this: quote, wishing I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. Think about that. What must that hollowness feel like in your dying breaths? Feel it in your body right now. What do you want to feel on your deathbed? Will you know you worked and fought for those you loved? Those are the stakes, folks. So I invite you onto the field. Not to fix everything, not to be perfect, not to move mountains, but to move at the pace of your possible. As the rabbi in Pirkei Avot says, it is not your responsibility to complete the work, but neither may you desist from doing your part. The Arete path is not easy. It demands everything from you, but it gives you everything too. It gives you joy. It gives you purpose. Aristotle called it eudaimonia, the full flowering of a life well lived, not ease, not applause, but deep alignment with your highest nature. It gives you yourself back. So the question isn't, will you be a leader? You already are. The question I ask you to ponder is this: who were you before the world told you who to be? And are you ready to reclaim that for yourself, for me, and for us? In the Greek tradition, wisdom was not knowledge alone. It was phronesis, practical wisdom, the kind that lives in what you do, not what you say. And courage was praxis, truth in motion. in motion. So lace up, not just for a run, but a quiet revolution. One built not on spectacle, but service, not on titles, but truth, not alone, but together. At the Civic Courage Lab, we are building the muscle of democracy, one choice, one practice, one human, one brave soul at a time. You don't have to do everything, but if you're ready to do your part, I invite you to come train with us. Let's remember who we are, who you are. Let's make Aristotle proud and rise together in courage. Aho. Thank you all for being precisely as you are. I love you all.
Thank you very much, Skippy, for an excellent presentation, telling us about arete versus apathy. Now, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and few moments rhyme more ominously with our own than Athens' crisis under the 30 tyrants. Our next speaker, Rosalind Fuller of the Solonian Democracy Institute, is a scholar of democratic systems, both ancient and modern. Her book, Beasts and Gods, explores how democracy's meaning has shifted and how we might reclaim its radical potential. Today, she'll unpack the lessons of Athens' collapse into oligarchy. What warnings does it hold for us? Dr. Rosalind Fuller.
So thank you very much. I'm going to just get right into showing you some slides here today. What I want to talk about a bit is what we can learn from an ancient crisis of democracy. Although, it has to be said, calling it a crisis is underballing it a little bit. But still, I think it holds some important lessons because I think the so-called ills of democracy in our present time are pretty much criminally misdiagnosed. Unfortunately, almost every affluent, allegedly educated person I've spoken to for about 20 years understands the term democracy to mean that things they like happen. When things they don't like happen, that's not just tough luck or you win some, you lose some. That means there's a problem with democracy, that they feel entitles them to redesign democracy to disempower as many people as necessary and deliver their own preferred preferences. This conflation of objective reality and personal desires has made it almost impossible to have a logical conversation about democracy and tyranny. Forms of government are defined by who holds power, not by your personal happiness with their rule. In a monarchy or tyranny, one person holds power. In an aristocracy or oligarchy, the top echelon of socioeconomic elites do. And in a democracy, the people hold power. In Aristotle's view, which is where this is from, the difference between these good and bad forms lay in how power was acquired, so whether there were pre-existing mechanisms for a transfer of power, and whether that power was exercised purely in one's own self-interest, or if there was some kind of effort to create a systematic government where people with differing interests and identities could rely on the rules rather than the whims of the group in charge. So when Aristotle differentiates between these two versions of majority rule, to put it in more modern terms, he differentiates between a kind of constitutional government on one hand and what we would probably call a dictatorship of the proletariat on the other. So where the masses have power, but they aren't really governing, they're just distributing spoils among themselves. It is very important when reading historical documents to understand that almost everything in history, and this is true up until the present day, was written by the very wealthiest, best connected members of society. So their ideas of when a government would cross the line to become a communist mob are probably very different than yours are, because probably you're the descendant of someone they would have considered a not very respectable person in the first place. However, nonetheless, there is agreement that the line exists somewhere, and this general categorization remains relevant to today, in that we need to think of democracy as what it really is, a form of government where the general public makes the decisions. It is important to consider this, because democracy is far from being a natural or default state of affairs. The default human state, up until now, is strictly hierarchical political and economic oppression. But the history of Athens shows us how a non-democracy can go to being a democracy, and thus it sheds some light on things you would not want to do in reverse. Creating democracy in Athens involved numerous steps to transfer power from the pre-existing aristocracy to the broader public in ways that were first economic and then political. So the first major reformer in the direction of democracy was a guy called Solon, who was given the mission of dealing with a highly polarized political and economic situation, in broad strokes, kind of similar to today's. And in order to improve that situation, Solon canceled mortgage debts, he abolished debt slavery between citizens, and he improved international trade, which were all major economic measures. He also opened attendance at the assembly, the central debating forum, and the courts to every citizen. So after this point, every citizen can attend those forums. And he also revised the laws to make them milder, which of course is also in the interest of more vulnerable people. So you may have heard of draconian measures or heard the term, something's draconian. And that's because there was actually a guy called Draco who had made the laws pre-existing the ones Solon made. And he had basically punished everything with death. So in very ancient Athens, pretty much everything was punished with death. And Solon kind of improved that and made the laws a bit milder from that. But when we talk about the word draconian, that's what we're referring to. So it's important to note that satisfaction with Solon's reforms was very low, actually, or quite low, I should say. And pretty much no one was happy with them, and the implementation also wasn't completely snag-free. Rich people thought Solon went too far. They did not collect on those debts, which really ticked them off. And poor people thought he didn't go far enough. They were still at a disadvantage economically and within many institutions. Nonetheless, this agreement basically held on enough for another guy, Pisistratus, to seize power. And already here, Aristotle's categorizations get hard to translate into reality because Pisistratus was undoubtedly a tyrant, but he wasn't a completely self-interested one. He instituted policies that enabled many average Athenians to enrich themselves through enterprise. And he did a lot to move the needle on the idea of a modern state by providing essential public infrastructure, which removes some things from charity or private provision and into the public sphere. And that's really, really important because it continued what Solon had started, making poor Athenians less dependent on rich ones. So more free in fact, and not just in word. Pisistratus' sons, however, did a less good job, as sons often do. And another reformer, Cleisthenes, came along, and he made a series of changes that are generally agreed to define Athenian democracy, and that were, again, aimed at diluting the power of the very wealthy. So this is a common theme in Athens through all these years. It goes in pretty much one direction, from the aristocracy to a democracy. In fact, after Cleisthenes was done, you could say that no one was really in charge of Athens, and that's what really defined Athens as a polity. Aristocrats had exercised a lot of power over who held office through traditional tribes, and Cleisthenes reorganized these tribal affiliations. He completely mixed them up in order to break that power. He came up with ostracism, which was a good way to resolve political disputes in the absence of a more authoritarian power on top. And he increased the power of direct decision-making bodies like the assembly while decreasing the power of officials. And many of them just became randomly chosen executors of the assembly after that point. So following these reforms, Athens became a state that was no longer clearly in the hands of rich or well-born people, or people who considered themselves the best, which is what aristocracy means. And that was much to the consternation of all of the rich and well-born people in Athens and other states. And more disturbingly, and to many commentators, just purely insultingly, after crumbling into the hands of the uneducated masses, Athens did not fall apart. It became more successful, richer, and powerful than ever. In fact, Athens, a previously poor country, became a superpower at the forefront of military technology. In fact, Athens went on to transfer even more power to the people through the reforms of Ephialtes, who did a lot to get rid of the last aristocratic stronghold, so those are the people who believed they were the best, as well as introducing pay for participation, which helped subsidize less affluent people to participate politically. The rate of participation required by the Athenian institutions was very intense and very frequent, and pay helped people take some time away from work to do so, as well as providing a supplementary source of income for some very elderly citizens unable to labor physically, which was, of course, much more common at the time. Most controversially, Ephialtes possibly began to think of democracy in somewhat universalist terms. This is interesting because ancient people didn't always have really fixed ideas about what other peoples in neighboring countries should be doing. But during this time, there was a huge earthquake, which was centered in the territory of Athens' great frenemy, Sparta, close by. And taking advantage of the disruption this created, the Helots, who were a kind of incredibly maltreated slave peculiar to Sparta, revolted. And the Spartans asked the frenemies at Athens to come over and help them put down the rebellion, which up until then had been a kind of normal thing to do. At this point, Ephialtes, the speaker, made the argument in assembly that the Athenians should not do this. They should just let the Spartans fry in the problem of their own making. So it's unclear if his considerations were purely to weaken Sparta as a competitor state or some kind of judgment on the institution of Helots. But although he lost that vote in assembly and the Athenians did eventually show up ready to help, the Spartans kind of took it that way. And they did become mistrustful of the Athenians and their democratic ways. Ephialtes was also one of the few people to ever be assassinated in Athenian democratic politics. And that also speaks to the fact that there were people in Athens who were not happy with these democratic turns of events. And about 50 years later, after that, there was a relatively minor oligarchic coup, followed less than 10 years later by the 30 tyrants. It's really important to remember that from the time of Solon's reforms, close to 200 years have elapsed at this point. So to look back from the 30 tyrants to Solon is like us looking back to the year 1825. And if you're wondering, hey, like what happened in the year 1825? Well, the Battle of Waterloo happened in the year 1815. People had recently ditched wigs, so it was a really long time ago. And democracy, it's important also to remember, democracy continued full steam after the 30 tyrants period for another 80 years. And some would say in less illustrious period form even after that. As a useful comparison, World War II ended 80 years ago today, this year. So there aren't short time spans we're talking about. They're really quite lengthy time spans. However, we have to admit, the 30 tyrants were an incredibly disruptive blip on that time span. They were, as the name indicates, 30 people who seized power, and their reign of terror lasted for 8 months, by the end of which they were killing each other. It would have been hard to gain control of a state where the average person was constantly participating in the assembly or in the courts, as I've described a little bit, and they were used to making decisions for their own lives. So the tyrants used shock tactics to do so. They disarmed everyone by stealth, and then they made a list of respectable people. And if you weren't on that list, you were fair game. The 30 tyrants are estimated to have killed 5% of the citizen population. So that would be like someone taking power and killing 50 million people in the US within 8 months today. So just purely logistically, it's amazing that they got it done. They even assigned themselves a medic, a resident foreigner, to kill and to confiscate their stuff. So this was a quite organized coup in some respect. But in another respect, it was complete chaos. And most people in Athens were living in complete chaos, and hardly anyone was even in Athens, in fact, because people were displaced or they had fled to the countryside. However, despite the ferocity of this attack, democracy was restored pretty quickly. A big part of that restoration was that many Athenians, as well as slaves and medics, regrouped around a general called Thrasybulus, who masterminded a counter-campaign against the tyrants from a kind of reassembly point some distance from the city. So 10 generals in Athens were elected on a yearly basis, and Thrasybulus was good at what he did, so he was often elected to this position. And he also happened to be out of Athens when the coup occurred, which turned out to be pretty lucky, but was also a factor of the Athenian system of distributed power. You know, with so many generals and former generals, it was just bound to be the case that they weren't all in the same spot at the same time. So although Stoicism hadn't been formally invented yet, it's fair to say Thrasybulus had more than his fair share of Stoic attributes. For one thing, he kept his cool in a complete panic situation. And for another, upon the success of this mission, he advocated for amnesty for the remaining tyrants, which was quite something considering, as well as for citizenship for the non-citizens who had helped him. And the people of Athens agreed to this amnesty, and they rewarded those who had fought with Thrasybulus, although not with citizenship. So through his calm philosophy, Thrasybulus probably succeeded in stopping what could have easily turned into another bloodbath and cycle of violence. So what can we learn from all this? Well, I think first it's really important to ask, why did the tyrants do what they did? One aspect is that they inhabited a class of people who were on the whole completely hostile to the concept of democracy, which they perceived not entirely wrongly as a threat to their entire way of life. And that is despite the fact that they actually didn't have it that bad. In fact, rich and aristocratic individuals who participated in Athenian democracy tended to have far greater impact than individuals without those advantages. They had the benefits of education and leisure, and therefore the means to make themselves heard. Quite a few wealthy and or aristocratic people took advantage of these opportunities, but a very large proportion of them didn't. And we should be wary, because this is the same point we've gotten to today. Very few wealthy people participate in democracy as citizens. They're only interested in forms of politics where their money speaks for them. So forms where they can use money as a weapon, buying membership, running people they don't like out of town, and most of all, making rules without public oversight. This is where you will find a lot of rich people today. Among Athenian aristocrats, it was also very fashionable to denigrate democracy, and quite a few of the most well-known philosophers from that time, like Socrates and Plato, participated in this. Many of the 30 tyrants were taught by Socrates, and the leader of the 30 tyrants, the leader, I should say, of the 30 tyrants, Critias, was actually a relative of Plato's. The records we have of all ancient societies are incomplete, and one of the reasons the anti-democratic philosophical work was comparatively well preserved and became so widespread as a basis for education is that in addition to being intelligent in many respects, it also conformed to the worldview of aristocrats and monarchs in the Middle Ages and into the early part of the 20th century. The views expressed about democracy in those works of philosophy were very much what they wanted to hear. And they were very much what people like the 30 tyrants wanted to hear as well. It's very important to remember that these remarks were made within the wider context of ongoing reality, like I'm telling you, 300 years at least. And reading these documents is therefore very much like listening to one side of an argument. Many average people at the time did not take seriously the idea that they were lawless idiots in an incompetent system, because they knew they weren't. After all, they've participated in very well-organized institutions over extremely long periods of time. Banks, insurance, mortgages, warrants, judicial review, urban drainage, these were all things known in ancient Athens. It was actually a very sophisticated and actually somewhat conservative society. Indeed, most of the people engaged in the philosophical crusade played pretty much no role in making government in Athens work at all. That was labor undertaken by people like Solon, Cleisthenes, Pericles, Thrasybulus, and many, many people who appear once or twice in the records, because that was what Athens was all about. A lot of the now vaunted writing was undertaken by people who were, as we say in Ireland, hurling from the ditch. Other people's contribution was to work and try to keep democracy going. Their contribution was to sit on the sidelines and criticize everything. To make matters worse, that criticism tended to hyper-focus on any perceived wrong of the people, or the poor, which was most people to them, and completely blank any failings of the rich. This should again remind us of today. In so-called educated circles, nothing has become more common than to philosophize about a perfect society and to attempt to institute the society instantaneously by force. Canceling people, punitive taxation intended to enforce certain buying behavior, censoring political speech, haranguing and harassing citizens, or paying others to do so, which is, again, very common, for having differing views. Critical thinking has come to be misunderstood as criticism for criticism's sake. To criticize is to be smart. I tell it to you, and I tell it to you straight. If Solon and Thrasybulus had sat around criticizing, we would not be here today. But this hurling from the ditch is very much a milieu the 30 tyrants would have been familiar with. Having, as most educated people today, identified people as the problem and root of policy they disliked, they logically came to the conclusion that they really needed to disempower people so they could get on with doing the right thing, which they had an amazing confidence in their abilities to do. Fortunately, the system of Athenian democracy was actually incredibly resilient to these tactics. Because people were actively involved in decision-making, thanks to all those other reforms I talked about earlier, they reacted quite quickly to the situation, and they were used to organizing ad hoc, coming to conclusions and implementing them, because that's what they did in democracy all day long. They didn't really need to receive instructions from anyone. They were used to doing things themselves. Even a deadly coup didn't manage to capture all the power holders in Athens, because everyone was a power holder. Moreover, when they had won, they had a strong idea of the situation they wanted to return to. So there was a template they could relatively easily call on. So even extreme, sudden criminal violence was something they managed to return to a stable state from and to peacefully regulate the aftermath. Educating people to be philosopher kings is a really bad idea. It's actually far worse than educating people to be just a normal non-philosophizing king, because it imbues power with a self-constructed religious element of cosmic good and evil. This inevitably deepens as a quest to change human nature, a totalitarian project, in the words of Hannah Arendt. And I must agree. What could be more oppressive than the belief that someone has the right to reach inside your mind and try to fix you? To add insult to injury, which is what the Athenians believed happened to them, this belief has often been propagated by the people least able to live their own professed morals. It's notable that under the 30 tyrants, Socrates was presented with an opportunity to commit a selfless act. The tyrants assigned Socrates a metic to arrest and to bring to them for execution, Leon of Salamis, who everyone seems to have agreed was a really nice guy. Socrates did not comply with his order. He went home. But he also didn't take the risk of warning Leon. And that's the difference between philosophy and real life. Thrasybulus may never have possessed an ideal, but he did risk his own life to stop the bloodshed, after which he immediately proceeded to not get his way on everything in assembly. The question we are confronted with is not, I believe, how we can talk a good game. The question is how we can ensure each person has a stake in society in which they are exposed to the practicalities of life at an early age. It seems strange now, but I was running a cash register at 14 years old, and nobody thought it was weird. I would argue that responsibility delayed has in many cases turned into responsibility denied. I don't believe we've ever talked a single person into being a better person. We've only taught people to become more and more judgmental as we inculcate them to be good people rather than responsible people. The Athenian reformers understood how to deal with people as they were, not as they would have liked them to be, and their efforts were crowned with great success. The 30 tyrants understood only how to try to implement their ideals, and their names are synonymous with a massacre. If you want to ponder something, ponder that. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Dr. Fuller, for telling us about the 30 tyrants and what we can learn from the Athenian crisis of democracy. I'm sure you're all thinking about possible parallels between what happened in ancient Athens and what's happening today in different countries. It's time for us to take a little break now. We will be back in about 8 minutes' time. Just enough time for you to run to the loo and get back again before the collapse of Western democracy. After our break, we'll be returning with the question, how does education shape democracy? And how might it help us to confront global crises? I think Jeff's going to put a countdown timer on the screen to let everyone know what time we're going to resume. We'll start again about 20 past, which is what time our next speaker is due to take the stage. So I'll see you all back shortly then. Hi, everyone. We're due to begin again in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to make an announcement before the next speaker takes to the stage about our next event, which will be about the philosophy and psychology of love and relationships. It's scheduled for the 25th of October, but you can register now to make sure that you've got your tickets. We haven't got the full program of speakers online yet, but we'll be putting that up pretty soon. We'll be talking about what the classics tell us. I'm guessing Ovid's Remedia Amoris might be something that we could talk about that would be particularly relevant. I might perhaps talk about the relationship between love and anger. That's one of my areas of interest. And Casey, my wife, might, if we ask her nicely, may be talking about relationships in relation to love, and maybe a little bit about philosophy and stoicism and CBT, how all these things relate to dependency and being a rescuer, which is what our current book is about. So I just wanted to make a mention of the next event. You can support us by registering in advance for that if you want to. That helps us to build a bit of momentum and to know that how much interest there is and what we're proposing to do. So it'll be about philosophy, psychology. It's kind of interdisciplinary event again about the nature of love and relationships. Now, I think it's time to welcome everybody back from the break. You're probably joining us for the next speaker. William O. Stevens is professor at Creighton University and author of Marcus Aurelius, A Guide for the Perplexed. There are many perplexed among us, as well as the forthcoming Marcus Aurelius, the Philosopher King. His work explores how philosophy can inform our approach to citizenship, sustainability, and shared humanity. In an age of nationalism and climate urgency, his talk offers a vision of environmental cosmopolitanism, an ideal rooted in wisdom and responsibility. Professor William O. Stevens.
Thank you, Donald. I want to thank you. I want to thank the Plato's Academy Center, the organizers, and my fellow presenters. Wonderful talks. Hope to contribute a few thoughts that are worth your attention. I will begin by sketching 5 tactics of authoritarianism, then turn to the role of education in democracy, the ethics of cosmopolitanism, and conclude with our ecological responsibilities as cosmic citizens. Authoritarians seek to disempower people by feeding them ignorance. The ignorant are easier to control, suppress, and bully. Authoritarians spread ignorance using 5 tactics. They rewrite history, they hamstring education, they squash science, they suppress the free press, and they attack the arts. They rewrite history. Authoritarians promote nationalistic or mythic versions of history, erasing inconvenient truths such as histories of racism, oppression, or state violence. They encourage so-called patriotic education while censoring mention of slavery, racial discrimination, or colonialism. They hamstring education. Authoritarians weaken critical thinking and independent knowledge production by defunding institutions of learning and promoting myopic ideologies. They intimidate, suppress, or fire teachers who challenge dominant narratives. They censor curricula and stigmatize programs of study they fear. Authoritarians want a compliant, incurious public that blindly obeys. In place of education, they peddle indoctrination. They squash science. Because science is inherently evidence-based and often contradicts authoritarian messaging, authoritarians defund research and erase inconvenient data. They discredit scientific findings supported by wide consensus. They politicize expertise, casting scientists as either enemies or pawns. Authoritarians hail their rulers as more powerful and credible than empirical facts. They suppress the free press. Authoritarians demonize journalists and media outlets that report on their mistakes, corruption, and lawbreaking. Authoritarians try to control what the public is allowed to know, broadcasting disinformation and denigrating honest journalism. And fifth, they attack the arts. Art, literature, and satire threaten authoritarianism by stirring the imagination, critique, and dissent. Authoritarians suppress artistic expression, defund the arts, ban books, or attack institutions they brand as subversive or unpatriotic. These tactics amount to a coordinated epistemic assault on reality itself. The result is not just misinformation. It's a society where truth is contested, memory is sanitized, and democratic institutions are hollowed out. The foundation of democratic societies is education, the indispensable bulwark against authoritarian brainwashing. Education cultivates rational, morally accountable citizens capable of thinking critically to shed bad intellectual habits. These bad epistemic habits include believing without sufficient evidence and clinging to comforting falsehoods. Ancient Greek and Roman philosophers emphasized character formation through practicing good habits. In contemporary virtue ethics, education shapes intellectual, emotional, and moral dispositions through consistent engagement and reflection. As democratic nations face graver threats, the role of public education in preserving democratic values grows. The ancients knew that humans are creatures of habit. For them, virtue arose from consistent right action, not just intellectual understanding. Roman Stoics emphasized ascesis, disciplined training, as necessary for moral progress. Stoic education involved not only learning doctrine, but also cultivating a steady disposition of mind and character. Public education in democracies should similarly aim to foster habits of critical thinking, open-mindedness, and moral integrity. Rising authoritarianism underscores the fragility of democratic habits rooted in evidence, science, and uncontroversial facts. Authoritarians and demagogues attack norms and the rule of law, spewing lies, hatred, and threats. They pardon cronies, flout court rulings, and treat constitutional principles as nuisances. They engineer cults of personality, surrounding themselves with flatterers and fools. They breed contempt for truth, celebrating impulse over reason. This directly opposes the philosophical ideal of reasoned deliberation. Authoritarians vilify expertise, scholarship, and critical inquiry. These attitudes reflect a glorification of power and a trumpeting of conspiracy-mongering fantasy over truth. Authoritarians may resent those better educated or wiser than themselves. If so, they fear millions of their fellow citizens whom they govern. In response, schools must cultivate civic and moral virtues essential to democracy: intellectual humility, respect for evidence, courage to speak the truth, and the wisdom to distinguish what is and is not within our control, a key Stoic insight. Teaching students to value reason, justice, and dignity inoculates them against propaganda and demagoguery. Defending virtues that nourish democracy is true patriotism. One antidote to disinformation is global awareness. A global perspective dispels parochialism and orients civic virtue through cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is the idea that all rational beings are fellow citizens of a shared community, the cosmopolis. Rooted in Socratic thought, associated with Diogenes the Cynic, and systematized by the Stoics, this idea affirms that we are not merely members of a city or nation, but of a wider moral community, When joined with environmental education, Stoic cosmopolitanism invites a further expansion. We are citizens of the biosphere, the thin shell of life enveloping the earth. For Stoics, to be a citizen of the cosmos meant recognizing our embeddedness in a larger, rationally ordered whole. They saw human beings as integral parts of the logos-governed universe, not as masters of nature, but as participants in its design. This perspective underwrites a form of ecological humility. Our flourishing depends on aligning our actions and technologies with nature's orderly unity. If we are parts of a coherent living whole, then our obligations reach beyond our own closest circle to all of humanity and to the entire wonderfully complex web of life that sustains it. This idea resonates with the philosophy of Murray Bookchin, whose theory of social ecology extends ecological awareness into the realm of political responsibility. Bookchin argued that ecological degradation stems from entrenched hierarchies and systems of domination that alienate humans from nature and from each other. Like the Stoics, he believed that human flourishing depends on living in agreement with nature. But for Bookchin, this required not merely moral insight, but radical democratic reorganization. He envisioned decentralized, participatory forms of governance in which communities manage their ecological resources collectively and justly. In this vision, education becomes a liberating force, one that cultivates critical, engaged citizens ready to confront both environmental crises and authoritarian power. Social ecology insists genuine environmentalism must also be a politics of freedom. Bookchin's framework thus complements Stoic cosmopolitanism by emphasizing that care for the biosphere cannot be separated from the fight for democratic self-rule. Just as cosmopolitan ethics asks us to see strangers as kin, social ecology asks us to see domination of nature as inseparable from the domination of persons. Together, these perspectives reinforce the central claim that education must awaken in students a sense of interconnection and responsibility, not only to other humans, but to the entire biosphere we co-inhabit. Environmental education grounded in cosmopolitanism fosters a feeling of planetary belonging and moral accountability. It teaches students to see environmental stewardship as integral to their identity as rational agents in a shared cosmos. Just as Stoic ethics urges justice toward fellow rational beings, an ecological ethic emphasizes duty to protect the systems that support all life. Ascesis can be reoriented toward resisting consumerism and ecological excess to live in harmony with the constraints of ecosystems. In this framework, environmental education becomes an exercise in oikeiosis. This is the Stoic concept of gradually extending concern from self to others to all life. A common myth, a false belief, is that the Earth or the biosphere is fragile. What is fragile is not the planet itself, but the ability of human civilization to adapt to radical alterations of complex systems on which our species depends. The biosphere has endured mass extinctions, asteroid impacts, volcanic cataclysms, and drastic climate shifts over millions of years, and it will endure long after our species is gone. What is at risk from anthropogenic climate change, pollution, and ecological collapse is not nature's existence, but its capacity to support human life and the biodiversity that enriches it. Rising sea levels, agricultural disruption, ocean acidification, and the loss of species pose no threat to rats, cockroaches, or extremophilic microbes. Rather, they imperil the ecological preconditions for our own flourishing. The systems humans destabilize, climate regulation, freshwater cycles, fertile soils, pollinator populations, these are not easily broken, but they are under increasing stress. Once ruptured, they struggle to serve the needs of human societies. The moral imperative, then, is not to save the earth in some abstract sense, but to preserve the livability of the only home our species has known. Education that cultivates awareness of this asymmetry between the robustness of nature and the precariousness of our place within it is vital for any politics of planetary responsibility. Ancient thinkers did not articulate environmentalism as moderns do, but their cosmologies suggest affinities. The early Milesian students of nature saw the cosmos as a dynamic order humans belong to. For these earliest philosopher cosmologists, like Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Empedocles, the world was not a backdrop to human life, but an intelligible, balanced scheme of which humans were an intrinsic part. Anaximander, for instance, introduced the idea of the apeiron, the indefinite or infinite, as the origin of all things, suggesting that all beings emerge from an undifferentiated source and return to it in a cycle governed by justice. His famous fragment says that things, quote, pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice according to the assessment of time, unquote, implying that natural change is guided by a kind of moral and cosmic equilibrium, which humans ought to respect. Heraclitus, likewise, emphasizes logos, the rational principle permeating all things. He asserts that harmony arises through conflict, the strife, eris in Greek, that underlies the unity of opposites. His cosmology encourages attentiveness to the dynamic but balanced character of the ever-changing world, and his famous assertion that nature loves to hide hints at a reverence for the mysteries of the natural order. Empedocles, drawing on both Pythagorean and mystical traditions, conceived of nature as governed by the interplay of love, philia, and discord, nekos, two cosmic forces that drive the cycle of unity and separation among the four elements. His warnings against killing animals reflect a spiritualized view of nature as sacred and continuous with the human soul. In these ways, the Milesians picture nature as an ordered divine process, one that calls for philosophical insight and ethical restraint rather than domination. Plato occasionally displays a kind of proto-environmental awareness, especially in terms of how human actions affect the landscape. In the Critias and Laws, Plato laments environmental degradation and supports basic land and water regulation, showing early awareness of how human actions impact nature. Plato's cosmology in the Timaeus emphasizes a harmonious, ordered universe governed by a divine craftsman, the demiurge. This image instills a reverence for the cosmos as a rational, living being. Aristotle's works contain rich discussions of nature, but not environmental ethics as such. In the Politics, he maintains that nature exists for the sake of the human being, a teleological view criticized for being too anthropocentric. His Meteorologica and On the Generation of Animals show keen interest in natural processes and biological interdependence, but they lack any call to preserve ecosystems. Still, Aristotle's recognition of interconnectedness in nature has inspired some ecological thinkers, especially those drawn to organicism in the philosophy of nature. And Aristotle's student Theophrastus explored the ecological relations of plants, recognizing how they respond to and depend on their environments. Porphyry, drawing on Plotinus and the Pythagoreans, argued against the consumption of animals on ethical and religious grounds. He viewed animals as ensouled beings, closely related to humans in the great chain of being. Harming them, he argued, pollutes the soul and obstructs its ascent toward the divine. His defense of animals as kin, whose victimization defiles human moral character, shows a profound concern for non-human life and for the ethical implications of human exploitation. Porphyry's thinking anticipates aspects of environmental ethics by challenging anthropocentric assumptions and urging non-violence toward all living, sentient beings. These philosophers lacked a concept of nature as something vulnerable to human exploitation on a planetary scale. They did not propose circumspect stewardship of ecosystems, but their philosophical frameworks brush up against ideas that later thinkers have drawn into more ecologically minded philosophies like deep ecology, biocentrism, or eco-stoicism. The holistic thrust of ancient views of nature and the cosmos suggests that civic virtues rooted in cosmopolitanism can mesh with our best scientific understanding of nature, climate, and biodiversity. But we need to connect the defense of democratic norms and institutions with the wisdom of treading lightly on the planet. All nations will crumble when the systems supporting the biosphere become too hostile and erratic to sustain our very young species. Hence, healthy democracies will depend on a robust education of planetary citizens that includes the history of ideas, philosophy, and science, including environmental science. Environmental cosmopolitanism can thus serve to support the education virtuous citizens rely upon to keep their democracies resilient. Can education overturn authoritarian regimes? Platonists, Aristotelians, Epicureans, and Stoics all believed that intellectual freedom is crucial for happiness. The Stoic Epictetus believed that getting an education involved discarding false beliefs about what is good, what is bad, and what is neither. Education, from this Stoic perspective, empowers us to achieve self-liberation from foolish beliefs indoctrinated into us by propaganda. False beliefs about what our roles are as members of communities and citizens of the state undermine our flourishing. To craft our characters and become just agents and responsible citizens, we need the oxygen of fair and equitable norms in our communities, local governments, and federal government. Schools, colleges, and universities must teach the history of authoritarianism, enabling students to recognize threats to democratic liberties. Lessons on the rise and fall of democracies, the importance of checks and balances, and the value of free speech are essential. All citizens in a democracy should be equipped to understand that patriotism requires loyalty to democratic principles, not the blind allegiance of followers entranced by a bold leader. Citizens must also embrace ecological responsibility. Our needs and wants are different. We all depend on stable ecosystems for clean air, clean water, food, medicines, and the necessities of life. So we need food, shelter, education, fulfilling work, and a sense of belonging, whereas we want comforts, conveniences, and luxuries. Without civic and ecological virtue, we doom ourselves to fragmented, isolated communities. Just as the Stoics trained themselves to respond wisely to adversity and temptation, schools must train young cosmic citizens to think critically, act ethically, and engage constructively with their human and ecological communities. In a time of rising authoritarianism, this mission is more urgent than ever. Tyrants are bullies. Bullies thrive when bystanders are too afraid to intervene. Cosmic citizens do not stand by. They call out bullies and oppose thuggery. Education should teach us to defend the weak and vulnerable. Democracies have no choice but to fortify education, public and private alike, to resist bullies, demagogues, and tyrants. Thank you for your time.
Thank you again, Professor Stevens, for telling us about democracy, education, and environmental cosmopolitanism. Now, resistance to tyranny isn't just a matter of protest, it's also about psychology, strategy, and moral resilience. Michael Fontaine, Professor of Classics at Cornell and author of the forthcoming How to Have Willpower, an ancient guide to not giving in, turns to Plutarch for timeless lessons on opposing oppression, both in public and private life. How do we resist without becoming what we oppose? How do we sustain courage in the face of fear? Professor Michael Fontaine.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I've got some slides I'm going to show you as I go, just to kind of keep things interesting. And thank you for the quick mention. This book I have coming out is the basis of what I'm going to say today. It should be out in a couple of weeks. So let me start. If you are interested in the topic of tyranny, then in the last few years, you've probably come across the expression anticipatory obedience. Has anybody heard that before? Tell me in the chat if you have. Anticipatory obedience. Now, that phrase was popularized in a book titled On Tyranny, and maybe it was even coined there by the historian Timothy Snyder. This is it. Snyder defines anticipatory obedience as the act of individuals preemptively aligning their behavior with what they believe a repressive authority wants, even before any explicit demands are made. This is what he writes. Snyder emphasizes that most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. That's the key phrase here, freely given, highlighting how people like you and me, by adapting in advance, inadvertently teach those in power the extent of control they exert over us. So that concept of tyranny, of obedience to tyranny, is what I'd like to discuss today, and specifically the emotion that gives rise to it. So let me start with a question for you. How do you feel when you come across this situation? When you go, I don't know, your favorite coffee shop, and the smiling cashier turns and flips that to you. Tell me in the chat, describe in a word, if you can, the feeling you get. Along the same lines as that feeling, I've got a few other questions for you. Have you ever found yourself agreeing to something against your better judgment just because you couldn't bear to say no? Maybe some friend pressed you for a favor, or a colleague floated a questionable plan in a meeting and you nodded along with it. Maybe you've signed some petition. Maybe you've even said yes to having sex that you were not all that excited about, or you weren't even sure about it, simply to avoid awkwardness. So these everyday capitulations might seem trivial, but they point to they're all the same, and they point to a profound human frailty. So according to Plutarch, our failure to utter a simple little word, the word no, under improper pressure is an age-old weakness. It's a failure that enables both personal capitulation and public tyranny. It's two sides of the same coin. In fact, Plutarch famously quipped, and I'll come back to this, he quipped that the entire population of the Middle East once fell under a tyrant's power because they couldn't pronounce one syllable. No, couldn't say that word. So in my time today, I want to talk about that weakness and how to overcome it as Plutarch describes it. The Greeks had a word for this inability to say no, for that emotion I asked you to describe. Their word is dysopia. It doesn't mean lack of vision. It's more subtle. Dysopia literally comes from roots that either mean bad face or downcast eyes. It's not clear which. It's the emotion that makes your face crumple with shame when you disappoint somebody. Plutarch defines it as an undue sensitivity to shame. In modern terms, we'd say it's an oversensitivity to what others think. It's your internal shame-o-meter has gone haywire. It's calibrated too sensitively. Because we feel ashamed to say no, we end up saying yes against our better judgment. Now, according to Plutarch, that emotional weakness can corrupt both our private lives and our public freedoms. So let me start by unpacking what he meant by this word dystopia and why he thought this emotion is so dangerous to us. So Plutarch introduces dystopia as a paradoxical flaw. On the one hand, the Greeks love the one hand and on the other. On the one hand, feeling shame is normally, that's a good thing. It's a good trait. It means you have a conscience. But excessive shame can backfire. Plutarch says that people with a healthy sense of shame make the very same mistakes that shameless people do. The difference is that unlike shameless people, they feel terrible about it afterwards. In other words, a pushover and a scoundrel might both give in to an improper demand. The difference is that the scoundrel, the asshole, the psychopath, that person isn't bothered by doing wrong, but the pushover agonizes over it. So the root problem is that the pushover is highly sensitive to even the appearance of a shameful action. Pushovers dread conflict, rejection, or being called or thought of as a mean person, so their resolve melts at the slightest pressure. And other people, shameless people, they know that. They already know that. So let's be careful here of a huge distinction. Plutarch is referring to situations when a request is made of us, an improper request, and it's in our power to say no. Nobody's putting a gun to our head, right? It's not that kind of situation. You can't say no then. Nobody's going to fire us if we say no. Again, you can't, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about socially awkward situations like that iPad tip request at the bakery. It's just really uncomfortable to say no. Plutarch notes the Stoics they absolutely insisted on distinguishing dystopia from the normal healthy shame, so much that they insisted on having this separate word for it. They wanted to make sure that nobody could use being nice as an excuse for cowardice. In modern terms, it's the difference between being kind and being a doormat. We ought to be kind, fair, and understanding, as we were hearing in some of the earlier talks. Plutarch says the same thing, but we shouldn't flatter ourselves, shouldn't play to your ego that caving in to some outrageous demand that's not really kindness. That's not flexibility. Those are weasel words we're telling ourselves to salve our egos, make ourselves feel better. It's really weakness. So for Plutarch, the stakes are enormous. Dystopia is not just some quirky little quirk. He says it's pathological, and if we leave it untreated, it's going to cause havoc. So why? Why does he say that about this shy, compliant temperament? This is the key point of my whole talk. Plutarch saw that emotional weakness in private interactions like this can scale up to injustice on a monumental scale, a society-wide scale. A tyrant, whether it's an overbearing boss, a corrupt official, or a literal dictator of a country, the tyrant thrives on our inability to say no. Plutarch says, quote, "The most unreasonable person is always the master of a pushover. The bully's shamelessness tyrannizes the other person's sense of shame and overpowers it." In other words, shameless people exploit and they rule over shamefaced people. And that's the recipe for both personal misery and political oppression. Now, Plutarch illustrates this contention with striking examples. In the private sphere, he says, dystopia can lead to personal disaster for your finances, for your health when you go to choose a doctor, for your children's education when it comes to choosing a school or a teacher. It can even, he says, cost you your life. And he's not exaggerating. He tells of men who suspected, these guys actually thought they were being set up for murder, but they still yielded to their so-called friends out of shame. One of these guys, a man named Dion, actually knew a friend might be plotting against him, but Plutarch says he felt ashamed to take protective measures against a close friend, so he didn't do anything, and he was killed. Another guy was the son of a king. He kept declining a dinner invitation because he smelled a rat, until the would-be killer shamed him into it, saying, "What's the matter? Are you afraid I'm plotting something?" Embarrassed at that, and embarrassed at seeming paranoid, the young man went to dinner, and they strangled him, Plutarch says, after the meal. So these are extreme cases, but they do dramatize Plutarch's point. Being unable to say no can be fatal. This next point is fascinating too. Plutarch actually talks about the bedroom. And now you got to remember, this is 1900 years before the Me Too movement kicked off. Plutarch says that in the bedroom, dysopia is a poor guardian of virtue. So he alludes to the familiar custom of pressuring young women, and for Greeks, pressuring young men or boys into sexual favors. Even a virtuous person can be sweet-talked and tricked into surrender by a persistent seducer. So shame, the reluctance to make a scene or to offend, is often what predators exploit. Plutarch matter-of-factly notes, quote, persuasion and pressure work all too often, even on women of virtue. So in modern terms and in modern times, how many times have you heard someone regretfully say, you know, I really didn't want to, but I just didn't think I could say no. I didn't feel like I could. So Plutarch would nod along with that knowingly. That is dysopia at work. Okay, so let's scale up and take this to the public sphere. Plutarch, as many of you will know, was deeply, deeply interested in the nature of tyranny. He understood, and this is key, that tyrants are not all powerful on their own. They are not the Marvel comics movies villains. These guys can't do it on their own. They rise because ordinary people like you and me yield to them. As I mentioned earlier, he shares his darkly humorous observation. He attributes it to some wag in his day, that all the inhabitants of the Middle East were enslaved to a single human being because they couldn't bring themselves to say one syllable. No. In other words, millions of people fell under the yoke of the Persian king because one by one they each kept quiet, or they complied, or they acquiesced instead of refusing unjust commands. So this ancient joke, and I'm going to come back to it, perfectly captures the link between private weakness and public oppression. A tyrant, whether it's the petty tyrant in your office or a dictator in the nation, is only as strong as our willingness to yes man these guys to power. This is, of course, almost exactly the same point that Timothy Snyder, the Yale historian, has been making in his books. So if that sounds abstract, let me consider some modern scenarios. Have you ever sat through a meeting where the boss floated some terrible idea and nobody dared dissent? So it's easy to imagine a room full of polite nods leading to some disastrous decision because each one of us felt more afraid, this is a quote of Plutarch, we felt more afraid of mean words than of physical harm. Nobody wanted to get called names or thought we were a bad person for objecting. So Plutarch observed this dynamic in his own world. He says, quote, people too often wimp out because they're more afraid of being called names than of real danger. Unable to stomach getting called stubborn or cruel, they sacrifice a noble cause. So history is rife with bigger examples. Policies nobody believed in, but nobody had the backbone to oppose. We have panics, we have persecutions that spiraled out of control because few people could face the social shame of speaking out. So whether it's a moral panic or a toxic groupthink in a company boardroom, a hiring committee at a university that's trying to make an appointment, or the rise of a political demagogue, the pattern is identical. When individuals collectively fail to say no to something wrong, tyranny finds an opening. So the emotional mechanics here are important to grasp. Dystopia typically strikes in the moment when saying no would cause a scene or invite disapproval. We feel inside this flush of social fear. Oh, you know, they're going to think I'm rude. I'm going to be ostracized. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm going to be Twitter stormed out of, all these thoughts. You have them, I have them. We have these feelings. So what do? We cave. So you know what? I'm just going to do it. Plutarch knows this. He says, ironically, by scrambling to escape the smoke of disgrace, we jump into the fire. Dystopia jumps into the fire. The very thing we dread, the shame, the regret, it comes back stronger. Plutarch points out that when you and I cave to pressure, we often end up facing even greater shame afterward. I bet you can think of examples now in recent memory here. Somebody who loans money, this is Plutarch's example, somebody who loans money that he or she can't afford to a demanding friend will soon be exposed and disgraced when he can't pay his own bills. Or a person who fudges the truth under pressure later endures public humiliation when the lie unravels. I mean, you see this every single day now on social media. So in trying to avoid a little private unpleasantness, we set ourselves up for a full-on ritual public shaming. This is interesting too. Plutarch even notes that we feel the regret instantaneously. We feel it in the moment that we give in. He says it's the same thing. He says with dysopia, unlike every other emotion, the remorse doesn't come later on. It comes simultaneously with the very act of caving. The second you agree to do something that you knew was wrong, you feel that knot in your stomach. You might even mutter under your breath, I know what I'm about to do is bad. In fact, that line is a quote from Euripides' Medea. Medea says that, and Plutarch quotes it in this very context because he thought it captured it so well. So why do we do it? Because in that split second, the avoiding conflict feels easier than enduring it. So we trade a short-term comfort for a long-term disaster. We were hearing earlier in Skippy's talk about courage, right? This is what we're talking about, courage to endure that short-term discomfort. So understanding this emotional bait and switch, the quick relief of saying, fine, I'll do it, versus the lasting guilt and the damage that can follow, that's the key to getting out of this. Once we see dysopia for the trap that it is, the Trojan horse that it is, we can get serious about escaping it. So how do you do that, right? How do we strengthen our will to say no when it counts? Instead of becoming, as Plutarch puts it, flat and soft terrain that gets walked all over. He says that's what we become. We become flat, soft terrain. We get walked all over. So his answer is training and practice. And this is fascinating. Unlike modern self-help books, Plutarch goes into great, concrete, specific, practical detail about how you're going to grow a backbone and start standing up for yourself. He offers a series of step-by-step scenarios. They're all familiar today that are going to work. And just in the interest of time, I'll give you one of them here. For example, Plutarch says, let's say you're at a dinner party. Somebody keeps refilling your wine glass, urging another toast, and maybe you've had enough. You say, I don't really want any more. This is low stakes social pressure, but a lot of people can't handle it. So he says, this is your first drill, step number one. The Greeks and the Romans, they drank a ton of wine. When somebody pours you more wine and you don't want to drink it, don't cave, don't force yourself to drink it. Plutarch says, just set the glass down on the table. That's it. Put it down. Politely, firmly, no thank you. No reasonable person in professional grown-up life is going to say, hey, you pick that glass up and you drink it now. Unless you're at a fraternity party, that's not going to happen. Nobody does that in the real world. So that's step number one. Or let's say a friend goads you into some small gamble or a dare, and you think this is a really stupid idea. Hey, let's jump off the bridge, or anything equivalent to jumping off the bridge. And maybe you don't want to do it, and your friend says, ha, you're a chicken, you're a coward. You know what Plutarch says? He says, agree. You should say, you're right. I am a chicken. I'm not going to do it. That's step number two. He says, this is going to work. So, and we have more and more steps along these lines. So along these lines, too, Plutarch uses a great analogy from the legendary orator Demosthenes. This is the greatest orator of ancient Greece. When the Athenians were in a panic at the sudden arrival of Alexander the Great's envoy, Demosthenes quipped, he says, look, if these people can't face a lamp, what are they going to do when they look at the sun? In other words, in plain English, if a little flicker of danger makes you freeze, how are you going to handle the blaze of a true crisis? So Plutarch, he brings this back to personal resolve. He says, what are you going to do in great affairs if a king comes asking? Or if some assembly, you got a whole room full of people pressuring you to do something, to sign off on a policy. If you can't even decline a glass of wine that a friend offers you, or if you're trapped in conversation with some person and you can't stand it and you can't even say, look, I got to be somewhere. If you can't do that, he says, come on, you got to get with the program. Okay, so Plutarch's solution to all this is training. One more, I just want to give you one more example here. The best training exercise, he says, to resisting this kind of pressure is to withhold applause. Have you ever been in a room where this has happened, or on social media? Because we're all social creatures, so this hits pretty close to home. We all feel like we should clap along with the crowd. It's almost instinctive, right? Especially on social media. Plutarch says, just try listening in silence when everybody else is cheering. if you think the performance is subpar, let's say some friend of yours puts on this cringingly bad performance. It's a song, a reading, Instagram picture, whatever it's going to be. And the whole room is erupting into polite applause. It's actually not that hard, Plutarch says, to simply withhold applause. Don't join the love fest. Don't join the amen corner of unearned praise. You don't have to boo. You don't have to make a scene. You don't have to thumbs down. All you have to do is not clap. Why does that matter? Because Plutarch again says, if you can discipline yourself to not give insincere praise to trivial situations, you're going to find it much easier to give honest feedback in serious ones. So Plutarch thinks of willpower as habit forming. It's scalable, it's stackable, right? So the more you do this in the easier situations, the easier it gets in every situation. So if your friend comes and says, hey, I'm thinking of running for mayor, or, I got this utopian scheme to reform the world, you can say, maybe I'm not so sure this is a good idea. I love you, but I don't know about this one. It gets easier to say that. So you need to learn to resist, says Plutarch, the tug of conformity. Okay, how else can you do this? Another step, you can practice on irrelevant people. So bring it back to the iPad tip request, right? So you're out of town. I don't know, let's say you are on a road trip somewhere and you go into the local, bakery, and the person behind the counter smiles, they flip the screen at you. What did they do? They handed you a cup of coffee. That's not traditionally it's not like table service. They're not carrying your bags somewhere. It's sort of what you already paid for. If you can summon the will and you don't think you ought to leave a tip, you clip no tip. Why can you do that? Because you're out of town. You are never going to see this person again. And if you think that's the right move, you're going to find it easier to do in similar situations going forward. You're going to become impervious. Okay. So just in my very closing minutes here, I want to tell you sort of a quick legacy, very quickly. Plutarch's insights on resisting pressure, all this might have remained a minor footnote in moral philosophy if it weren't for a fascinating thread of influence that stretches into modern history. So a very quick journey. In 16th century France, there was a very young writer, a law student, named Etienne de la Boétie. So in the 1570s, this guy wrote a short work whose title says it all, on willing servitude, on voluntary servitude, on being a slave voluntarily. So in this book, he proposed a radical idea. He says, what if tyrants only remain tyrants because people keep obeying them? His argument in this book is that the way to defeat tyranny is simply to stop complying with unjust authority. That's all you got to do. Just stop complying. We heard in the last talk about Socrates refused the order to go murder a man named Leon of Salamis when the 30 tyrants told him to do it. He didn't make a scene. He didn't speak out. He just went home. Everybody else, they did go off and they killed poor Leon. Socrates just went home. So he said, and so La Boétie says, if enough ordinary people refuse to yield, the whole edifice of tyranny will come crumbling down. You don't need war. You don't need violence. This is a bold call for mass civil disobedience. So why do we care about this book? I mean, obviously it's fascinating. Well, La Boétie had a friend, Montaigne, the famous essayist of the Renaissance, wrote in French. And he has a remark in his essay where he talks about this book. And he wrote that Plutarch says that the inhabitants of the Middle East came to be enslaved to one man because they couldn't pronounce one syllable. No. This saying of Plutarch's perhaps gave matter and occasion to La Boétie to write his book on voluntary servitude. So historians have since debated whether this is true or not. It looks like it's probably actually not true. I have a footnote on this in the book. But in a way, it doesn't matter because Montaigne's influence carried Plutarch's ideas forward and put it into the cultural bloodstream and associated these ideas. So if we fast forward a few hundred years, in the 18th and 19th century, this book was rediscovered on voluntary servitude. It was rediscovered by thinkers who were grappling with tyranny and freedom. It caught the attention of figures like William Emerson and Henry David Thoreau in America and Leo Tolstoy in Russia. So Tolstoy, the great novelist and social reformer, was especially struck by this. And through Tolstoy, these ideas traveled to the two people who put them dramatically into action with world historical consequences, Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As you know, these men both pioneered the techniques of mass nonviolent resistance, whether against British colonial laws in India or the American South. And so we have, it looks like a golden thread that leads directly from the essay I've just described to you straight to this. This is real, this is moral philosophy in action. So you start with Plutarch's essay 1900 years ago, and you end up with the Montgomery bus boycott. So that's it. That's what Plutarch has to say about private versus public submission to authority and things we might think about how to resist it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael, for telling us about Plutarch on defeating tyranny. I can't help but mention very briefly that some of the exercises that you mentioned are identical to things that we find in assertive training in modern cognitive behavioral therapy. And another interesting bit of trivia for you is that assertiveness training has massively declined in popularity since the 1990s for some curious reason. Now, no philosopher has scrutinized democracy's vulnerabilities more acutely than Plato. Angie Hobbs, professor of philosophy at the University of Sheffield and author of Why Plato Matters Now, unpacks his famous warning, how democracies can decay into tyranny through polarization, demagoguery, and the erosion of truth. In an era of misinformation and strongman politics, her talk couldn't be more urgent. Professor Angie Hobbs.
Hi, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. And thank you to Plato's Academy Centre for organising this. Thank you for just being the Plato's Academy Centre. You're a bright light in an increasingly murky world. And thank you to all my fellow guests. I'm really enjoying all your talks. And thank you for everybody for attending this fantastic event. I think it's really important that we build all these alternative communities right now. And just following on from what Mike's just been saying, I am mindful of Oki Day in Greece. I think it's the 28th of October, No Day, when celebrated in Greece and of course Cyprus, to celebrate when Greece refused the ultimatum of Mussolini in 1940. So the courage to say no is really important. And we were hearing about the importance of courage earlier from Skippy. Okay, so right, here we go. I can't resist this. I mean, I know it's everywhere, but it's so gorgeous. Here we got Raphael's School of Athens, and you can still see it in the Vatican, absolutely gorgeous. Here we see Plato in the center, fetchingly dressed in cerise, pointing upwards to the perfect realm of the eternal forms. And then on his left, we've got Aristotle, winsomely dressed in azure blue, pointing down to the earth, as saying that that's where reality really lies. Okay, so apologies if my voice is slightly croaky. I'm recovering from COVID. Not too bad, but voice slightly croaky still. Now, Plato's relationship with Athens and Athenian democracy, I mean, it's a little more complex than is sometimes presented in the secondary literature. You often just read that Plato is the ultimate arch critic of democracy, hates everything about democracy. It's a bit more complicated than that. So for instance, in order to write his dialogues and establish the academy that we've been hearing about, and of which Plato's Academy Centre is the wonderful legacy, Plato needed to grow up and be educated in Athens. He needed to hear and meet the very wide range of thinkers, both serious and specious, who flocked to Athens at the end of the 5th century BCE. He then, as we'll see a bit more later, he needed to leave it after his mentor and friend Socrates was put to death in 399. We'll hear more about that in a moment. And then he needed to return after his years of traveling. He needed to return to set up his academy, as far as we know, the first roughly higher education institute and research institute in the West. So the simplistic picture that you might have come across in some of the handbooks has Plato unconditionally hostile to Athenian democracy, far more sympathetic to Spartan oligarchy, but not quite. So we've been hearing earlier about the Spartan-backed oligarchic coup and the 30 tyrants that took place in 404. Now that included two relatives of Plato, Critias and Charmides. Now they invited Plato to join them. Why wouldn't they? He was a young relative of theirs, but he doesn't. He holds back to see what they would do, how they would behave. And their brutality and corruption utterly revolted him. And as the seventh letter, I'll say a bit more about the letters in a second, he, quote, drew back from the evils of the time. Now, there's a big debate about whether any of the letters attributed to Plato are genuine. If any of them are genuine, I guess the seventh letter is the strongest candidate. I personally don't think it was written by Plato, but I do think it was written by somebody who knew him very well and written shortly after his death, very possibly his nephew Speusippus, who in fact took over the headship of the academy after Plato's death. So I mean, it's a very odd letter. The summary of Plato's philosophy in it is really bonkers. You can ignore that, I think. But the account of his life, I think, is probably much more likely to be close to the factual truth. Now, when the democracy, as we have been hearing, was restored in 403, now Plato was initially relieved that it was restored, and he initially held out some hopes for it. He even considered entering political life in the democracy. It would have been expected of him. He was from an aristocratic family. It was expected he would go into politics. And initially he thought they behaved okay. He was moderately impressed, but then he thought the bad men started to take over and he was revolted by their brutality and their thirst for vengeance, not amongst all the Democrats, but amongst some of them. And of course, yes, sorry, I've just been laughing at Donald's Plato for President message there. Well, possibly. When his beloved Socrates was put to death in 399, I mean, that was enough. He'd had enough, and it may also have been dangerous for him to stay. So he takes off. He takes off for 10 years, really, of traveling around the Greek world, initially to the philosopher Euclides and his circle in Megara near Corinth. And then 10 years of traveling, almost certainly visiting the mathematician Theodorus in Cyrene, modern Libya. He almost certainly visited Egypt at least once, and then probably interspersed with periods of military service back in Greece. He would have had to do that. So he's having a really varied range of experiences. And absolutely key is a visit to the court of the tyrant Dionysius I of Syracuse around 387. Now, this, according to the seventh letter, this was a pretty dramatic visit, and indeed to Plato's later biographer Diogenes Laertius. He seems to have had increasingly fractious dealings with Dionysius. Diogenes Laertius says that he forcefully criticized tyranny to Dionysius's face. That didn't go down well, if that's indeed what happened. And then, according to reports from late antiquity, and they're unverifiable, sadly, but fun to believe anyway, on his return journey to Athens, he was sold into slavery on the island of Aegina at the orders of a vengeful Dionysius. Well, anyway, so possibly true. And happily for philosophy, he was ransomed either by a Cyrenaean called Anacharis, who he would have become friends with when he visited Cyrene, or by unnamed friends. Anyway, a dramatic life. In any event, whatever the truth of all that, this first trip to Sicily was it powerfully informed his coruscating attack on tyranny in the Republic, which was probably written in the 370s. Now, we were hearing earlier from Diane about the 5 different kinds of character type outlined in the Republic and their degeneration. In this talk, I'm going to concentrate on the corresponding degeneration of the 5 different types of philosophical constitution. So just to zoom over the first 7 books of the Republic in a few seconds, in books 2 to 7, the character of Socrates outlines the ideally just city run by philosopher rulers. I agree with what we were hearing earlier, that it would not be good for cities to be run by philosopher rulers, though it's tempting at times, but maybe philosophical advisors would be a good thing. Anyway, this ideal city, says the character of Socrates. Oh, and just by the way, as I'm sure you know, Plato never writes in his own voice. Another invitation to all of us to join in the conversation, the open debate. He writes dramatic dialogues with various characters, and very often Socrates is a character in the dialogues, though you shouldn't assume that the words put into the mouth of the character of Socrates would have been endorsed necessarily by the historical Socrates, and who concentrated mainly on ethics, whereas in the Republic, Plato does absolutely everything, ethics, not just ethics, but psychology, political theory, theory of knowledge, metaphysics, aesthetics, the whole lot. Anyway, Socrates, and that's my shorthand for the character of Socrates, says that the ideal city will inevitably decline. And in books 8 and 9 of the Republic, 4 forms of degenerate state are discussed in descending order of corruption, and they match the character types that Diane was telling us about earlier. Excuse me, bit of post-COVID water here. So we have timocracy, this aristocratic regime characterized by love of honor, which is time in ancient Greek, victory and worldly success. Oligarchy, ruled by the few, governed by love of wealth. Democracy, ruled by the people, and it has all sorts of characteristics. We'll come back to this in a moment, but particularly it loves freedom from external controls. We're going to say more about different kinds of freedom and how they play out. And then bottom of the pile, tyranny, brutal authoritarian rule by one man, and it's only a man envisaged as a tyrant at this time, governed by an overweening obsession. So the tyrannical character meets in the tyrannical state. We should note immediately that Plato only has experience of direct democracy when the male citizens of Athens in the assembly vote on issues directly. No women, no slaves, no resident foreigners, but just the adult male citizens. He doesn't know about representative democracy. Okay, so not exactly 3 cheers for democracy from Plato, but half a cheer in the Republic. So in the depiction of democracy, he gives us direct democracy in book 8. It's not favorable, perhaps not surprising, given he'd witnessed it putting his beloved Socrates to death. But it's not entirely hostile. It's a brilliant satire of how he sees contemporary Athens. He depicts the charms of democracy. He says it's varied, tolerant, free-spirited, it's colorful, it's fun. And he has a lot of fun in his depiction. He it says it's so free-spirited, it's so anarchic that even the animals in a democracy just walk around the streets and do what they please. But he also depicts what he views as its many weaknesses. It is contemptuous, he says, of expertise. It hates the experts. It is chaotic and fickle, always changing its mind. Shall we put this island to death? Shall we not put it to death? Changing their mind from one day to the next. And inattentive to anything other than immediate pleasures. Again, linking to the democratic character, beloved, which is very besotted with short-term pleasure. And consequently, because in democracies, people are not focused on the bigger picture. They're not focused on what's really happening. They're just looking for the next quick hedonistic fix. They are very easy to dupe. They are very vulnerable to attacks from both without and even more dangerously from within. And Plato is really clear through the character of Socrates that democracies can destroy themselves. And he gives us, in one of the most celebrated, I think justly celebrated passages in the Republic, an absolutely laser-sharp analysis of how a democracy can be subverted into tyranny by a cynical and opportunistic populist leader, a demagogue. Ruled by the people, democracy collapsing into demagoguery, which is manipulative leading of the people. Because, as we've seen, although Plato was no fan of direct democracy, he did think it hugely preferable to tyranny, which, as we've also seen, he'd had direct experience in Sicily at the court of Dionysius I. And not just tyranny, he'd had experience in Athens of demagogues, swaying the assemblies, swaying the law courts. And he'd grown up hearing stories of the most notorious demagogue of them all, Cleon. Now, before we look at this laser-sharp analysis of how democracies destroy themselves, we need a really important philosophical point that Plato makes. He makes it in the Republic. He also makes it in an earlier dialogue called the Gorgias. And this really matters because it brings us to two different kinds of use of the word freedom in ancient Greek as in ancient Greek as well as in contemporary politics and ethics. True rule, says Plato via Socrates, true rule can only take place if the ruler or rulers act from full and accurate information, true facts, and if they have the chance for rational deliberation. Because you need accurate, full information and the chance for reflection and deliberation before you can make a truly rational choice. And that is distinguished, true choice, rational choice is distinguished from acting on a momentary whim, just doing whatever you happen to feel like doing at the moment. For those of you who are interested in the ancient Greek terminology, the distinction in these passages is between boulomai, here used in the sense of I choose, I rationally choose, as opposed to moidoke plus an infinitive. It seems a good thing to me to do. I feel like doing X. So we have this really important distinction between doing what you actually choose to do because you know what you're doing, because you've got the full facts and information, you've had a chance to think about it, and doing what you just happen to feel like doing on the spur of the moment, on a whim. Those who act on unreflective, ill-informed whims, thinks Plato, are at risk of being manipulated by opportunistic demagogues. And in this very famous passage, Republic 562a to 569c, which I would urge you all to read if you read nothing else in the Republic, read this passage, please, provides us an incisive, chilling analysis of how this happens. So the demagogue, this populist leader, first gains power through democratic mechanisms. They persuade people to vote for them by claiming to be a champion of the people and making wild promises. They create a cult following, the demagogue creates a cult following around himself. His cult followers think he can do no wrong, and he very quickly starts to identify himself as an individual with the people as a whole, i.e. the people who agree with him and vote for him. But anyway, just called the people. Makes these wild promises which can't possibly be kept. And in particular, he offers intoxicating quantities of the neat spirit of independence, freedom. Freedom is the rallying cry of these populist demagogues everywhere, says Plato. By freedom, the demagogue means freedom from external control, what later philosophers such as Isaiah Berlin will call negative freedom, i.e. nobody telling me what to do, nobody interfering with me acting on my wishes, as opposed to what Plato calls true freedom, which he says in those passages we've looked at in the Gorgias and the Republic. True freedom, says Plato, comes from within, and it means when you're acting from rational choice and you have control over your own desires and actions. And it's that kind of freedom later philosophers like Berlin will call positive freedom. And again, just as the distinction between rational choice and acting on a whim is really important, so this distinction between negative freedom, nobody else telling me what to do, nobody interfering with me doing whatever I feel like, and positive freedom, me having the knowledge, the experience, the facts, the reflection to make a really informed, rational decision and having control over myself. That's a really important distinction. And of course, those two pairs link up. Okay, anybody who opposes the demagogue is labeled a hater of the people, because of course he's just identified himself with the people. So anybody who opposes him is hating the people, he says. And later this phrase, of course, morphs into the phrase an enemy of the people. It's a really dangerous phrase. And whenever you hear the phrase a hater of the people or an enemy of the people, it should ring a lot of alarm bells. It nearly always means somebody who is opposed to what I personally, the demagogue or the tyrant, want. And they are exiled or killed. And Socrates is really clear about how the demagogue corrupts the legal system and corrupts the courts and the judiciaries and brings baseless charges against his opponents and corrupts the courts. So these people are found guilty in a fake trial. Okay, and here's a picture from another book I've written. Why Plato Matters Now comes out next month in the UK and Europe, I think, and in the October in the States. This is from an earlier book, A Guide to Plato's Republic, with gorgeous illustrations by Angelo Rinaldi, and that's the tyrant in action. Now, these tactics of exiling and killing your opponent naturally create genuine enemies of the families of those you've exiled or killed. And so the demagogue quickly acquires a large bodyguard and becomes more and more suspicious, thinks everybody is against him, there are enemies everywhere, and eventually the demagogue acquires a private army, separate from a state army. The demagogue also stirs up external conflicts all the time. He wants his people to be fearful all the time, in need of a strong leader. If you keep your people fearful, they are less likely to resist. They're not in a position to resist, and they may want you to stay in power because they think you're the only person who can save them. And here's a really important point, which we should do well to remember now. As the demagogue gained power through the votes, through the support of the poor, it's in his interest to keep his people poor as well as fearful, because they are his power base. And also poor people are going to be less able to fight him and to resist him. For all these reasons, and he keeps them poor through the endless war taxation, so that keeping people poor and stirring up external conflicts, they all go together. For all these reasons, says the character of Socrates, a tyrant must always be provoking war. So at this stage, we've really slipped over from demagoguery into tyranny proper. Because when the people start to rebel, protesting that this is not why they voted him in, and they start to realize what kind of a creature they've created, he attacks them too. He turns on his original supporters too, and he starts to imprison, exile, kill them too, and the full-blooded tyrant is born. Socrates says graphically, the man becomes a wolf. Having tasted blood, the man becomes a wolf. He does not mince his words, and he does not mince his words as well when he sums it up by saying democracy has become enslaved. Okay, a couple of final points. It's really critical, really important. If we want some hope out of all this, I think there is some hope, and we need to bear the following points in mind. It's vital to bear in mind that Plato thinks that democracies become vulnerable to this kind of political subversion when moral language becomes corrupted. There's a passage in the Republic, and Socrates says, when you've got this subversion of moral language, licentiousness is called liberty and freedom, so a bad thing is called a good thing. Moral shamelessness is actually called courage, just turning them around. And similarly, he says shame, a sense of shame, a good sense of shame is called cowardice. Temperance is called utter foolishness. So you've got this utter subversion of how moral terms should be used. And it's a passage in the Republic which I think clearly echoes the great historian Thucydides' account of the subversion of moral terms in the Corcyraean Civil War. Corcyra is now Corfu. A very famous passage in Book 3, Chapter 82, Section 4 of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, when he again talks about how the Civil War started with this corruption of language. So for both Thucydides and Plato, the corruption of moral language both presages and fosters the corruption of morals. And this gives us our glimmer of hope. Because for those of us who care about democracy and want to try to guard it, the lesson is really clear that words really matter. And if we want to do our little bit to protect democracy, we need to use words with great care. And we need to call out deliberate or accidental misuses whenever and wherever we find them. And that will sometimes take courage, as we were hearing earlier. We can't solve the problems of the world, but we can do our little bit. And one thing we can do is to be careful how we use language and call out deliberate or accidental misuses of it. If we don't, we are going to be becoming increasingly vulnerable to this kind of manipulation, of being led. We're going to very quickly slide from the people leading to the people being led and manipulated. But it is in our power to do a bit to save democracy. And events like this, which Plato's Academy Centre run, which invite us all to come together from all over the world. I counted so many different countries when I was looking through those, attending even the online debate earlier. This invites us to form a community. We can give strength to each other. We can support each other in the importance of using language carefully, of thinking, of reflecting, of calling out lies, of standing up for the truth. And that will take moral courage and sometimes physical courage too. But it can be done, and it's what we can do. We can do something. So thank you very much. And as I said, I talk about these ideas in a lot more length in Why Plato Matters Now, being published by Bloomsbury next month.
Thank you once again. Thank you very much, Professor Hobbs. As a special bonus for attendees, Bloomsbury is offering 20% off pre-orders of Professor Hobbs' upcoming book, Why Plato Matters Now, which comes out on the 28th of August, I believe.
Yeah, in Europe, it's in October in the States, but it's in October Europe and certainly the UK, it's out in August. You can pre-order, yeah.
And there's a code that's Plato20 that you can use at bloomsbury.com. Yep. I think we'll show that on the screen just to remind everybody. Okay, thanks again. That was an amazing talk. We've had so many amazing talks today. Hopefully everyone's also seeing the subtle parallels between the concerns of ancient philosophers and some of the things that we may be observing in the information age even today. Our final speaker, before we do our panel, is James Rom. He's going to blend history and philosophy to explore Plato's real-world encounter with tyranny. A professor at Bard College and the author of Plato and the Tyrant, which examines Plato's fraught relationship with Dionysius of Syracuse and what it teaches us about the limits of idealism in politics. How do philosophers engage with power without being corrupted by it? Professor James Rom.
Well, thank you, Donald, and thank you to the Academy. I want to bring things back to the first speaker we had, who referenced a famous sentence in the Republic, and I'll read it for you now. Unless philosophers become kings in the cities, or unless those now termed kings and rulers truly and fully practice philosophy, there will be no cessation from troubles for the cities, or, I think, for the human race. That's been described by Paul Shorey as the most important sentence in all of Plato, and it's certainly a memorable one because it suggests that Plato really was trying to save the world with a recourse to a new model of government by a philosopher king. What's fascinating is that in his life, he actually had an opportunity, or so he thought, to create, if not a philosopher king, a absolute monarch who was partly philosophic. And I'm going to pick up the thread where our last speaker, Angie Hobbs, left it off with Plato's visit to Syracuse, the Greek city on the island of Sicily, in 388 or 387. Plato is about 40 years old, and as Professor Hobbs told us, that visit didn't go terribly well. From all that we hear, and we don't have direct testimony, we have only indirect, but from what we know, Plato was dismissed summarily, and perhaps, we don't know for sure, sold into slavery at the request of the tyrant on his way home on the island of Aegina. We should note that the foundation of the Academy, Plato's institution in Athens, directly follows this episode. So he came home from Syracuse, or perhaps from Aegina, having been ransomed by friends from slavery, and immediately thereafter, as far as we can tell, founded the Academy. And I believe, many others do too, that there's a close link between these two events. That is, having seen firsthand what autocratic government was doing in Syracuse, not approving of it, but seeing its possibilities as a new kind of institution. Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse, was experimenting with a radically amped up version of tyranny, importing some of the trappings of monarchy from the Persians and the Eastern potentates that the Greeks thought of as god kings. He essentially was making himself a superhuman sort of figure, and therefore exerting a higher degree of control than any previous Greek ruler, Greek tyrant had achieved. Seeing the possibilities that such a ruler could provide the means by which a philosophic state could come into being. Now, the Republic deals with the question, how could we institute a philosophic state, a perfectly just city-state? Those who are listening to Socrates, excuse me, are not satisfied that that it's worth talking about these things unless they can be achieved in real life. So they ask, can this really be achieved? And Socrates gives somewhat, he temporizes a bit, but he does say that you could either make a philosopher a king, or you could make a king into a philosopher. Now, while he had been in Syracuse, Plato, although he'd alienated the ruler, had made a very close friend, probably a lover, in the figure of Dion. We heard about him earlier in the discussion of Plutarch, who was the brother-in-law to Dionysius. His sister had married, was one of the two wives of Dionysius. He was close to the throne, not in the line of succession, but a deeply philosophical man, a man with great interest in Plato's ideas. In fact, it was probably he who had invited Plato to Syracuse to begin with. The two of them formed a kind of ideological partnership. And Plato says in the seventh letter, now I'm making reference to the seventh letter as a genuine document. We heard from Professor Hobbes, who doesn't think it's genuine, who thinks it's written by Plato's nephew and successor, Speusippus. That's okay with me. We don't need to argue that out. If it's by Speusippus, it still contains very well-informed and genuine material. Plato says that he told Dion that they should try to put into practice the ideas of Plato's philosophy. That is, they should try to institute some of Plato's ideas in the government of Syracuse. I'm talking about practical politics rather than theoretical. Most of what we've been discussing today, especially in regard to the Republic, has been theoretical in nature. But I think it's important to see that Plato also had practical goals. The Academy had practical goals. Some have described it as the Rand Corporation of Antiquity, or the Woodrow Wilson School, for those familiar with the Princeton institution that helps train leaders to go back to their home countries and be part of government, or the Kennedy School at Harvard. The young men who came to study, and in two cases women, who came to study with Plato, yes, many of them were theoretical thinkers, mathematicians, physicists, astronomers, but there were also those interested in political change. And we know that some of them went back to their home cities and took part in reforms to the Constitution, creations of law codes, assassinations of tyrants. So 3 of Plato's students are known to have assassinated kings and tyrants who were highly abusive to their people, who were off on the wrong track. And one of them seems to have had philosophic goals behind that violent act. We have other letters in the Platonic collection, so I don't want to argue the case for the genuineness of the letters, but there is at least a chance that many of them are genuine. They haven't been thrown out of court decisively. And at least 2 of them show Plato, if it's he, communicating with people we might think of as plants at the courts of monarchs, his students who had gone to monarchic courts in an effort to steer them in a philosophic direction. So all this suggests that there were practical goals in the Academy and in Plato's own thinking that make perhaps an uneasy juxtaposition with some of the theories of his dialogues. Now, Plato himself becomes a practical agent in 367 BC, 20 years after his departure from Syracuse and his founding of the Academy. He returns to Syracuse because the ruler Dionysius, who we now have to call Dionysius the Elder, has died, and his son, Dionysius the Younger, unfortunately the names are the same, came to power in his place. A young man, 30 years old, who had not been well educated as a youth. His father had kind of kept him in isolation, kept him away from people who could teach him or make him a wiser man. And Dion, the brother-in-law of the former ruler, his uncle, is now senior statesman, senior advisor to the crown. Dion convinces this young man of 30, to bring Plato to court to educate him in philosophy, thinking he could become a truly estimable ruler, a man loved by his people rather than a man feared. And this would make him a better ruler than his father, make him a king instead of a tyrant. Plato makes the distinction in the Republic between two kinds of monarchy, kings and tyrants, kings being philosophically enlightened, tyrants only interested in power and pleasure. So Plato returns to Syracuse 20 years after. He and Dion are still very close, too close for the liking of Dionysius the younger, who is fiercely jealous and believes that there's some kind of conspiracy to oust him from power. He banishes Dion from the island on a pretext to get him out of the political landscape. Plato is left there stranded in a very uncomfortable situation and finally makes his way home only after being detained under a kind of house arrest for several months. Things didn't go very well. You would think Plato was done with Syracuse, but no. 6 years later, at the request of Dionysius the Younger, Plato goes back a third time in another attempt to educate a tyrant in philosophy, to steer the regime in a more philosophic direction. He didn't think of this as a chance to create the Republic, a chance to make a philosopher king, but it bore out his thesis. He was attempting to bear out his thesis that philosophy and governance should go hand in hand, that the best kind of regime would be an autocratic one. He made no bones about that, but with an autocrat who was philosophically trained. His third visit went even worse than the previous two. He continued to advance the cause of Dion, trying to get him recalled and restored to his position. That made Dionysius fiercely angry and jealous again, even more so than before. And Plato was removed to a location where his life was actually at risk from the tyrant's mercenary soldiers who thought of him as a threat to their livelihood, thinking that he was trying to get the regime to dismiss its military guard. He called upon help from outside. The ruler of nearby Tarentum, a man named Archytas. Some of you may know of him. He was, in some ways, the true philosopher king, a man of great learning, a Pythagorean, who came to the rescue, exfiltrated Plato from Syracuse, and got him safely back to Athens, when he easily might have been killed. So this was a dangerous and disastrous episode. Things got even worse in the years to come. And I'll truncate the story because I know we're behind time. But Dion, having been ousted, having his estate stripped from him, came back to Syracuse, ousted the leader from power by a military coup, and took power himself. And Plato's fourth letter, which I also believe to be genuine, is an effort to this time steer Dion's regime in the right direction, seeing that his protege was now in power and perhaps had a legitimate chance at becoming a philosopher king, or at least a philosophic king. Dion didn't fulfill those hopes. He was assassinated in turn by another student of Plato, and the city descended into civil war. Plato's letters, the seventh and eighth letter in particular, are his efforts to deal with a debacle that had emerged on the island of Sicily. Syracuse was a total failure for the academy, a deep embarrassment, and it's clear that Plato was trying to explain himself to his contemporaries, extricate himself from blame, exonerate himself, and exalt the figure of Dion as the ideal ruler that would have been had he survived. These are practical goals deeply informed by the judgments of his contemporaries, the Athenians who thought he'd behaved badly, thought the academy had gotten in too deep, and that they were playing footsie with autocrats when they shouldn't have been. And that criticism is very hard to dismiss. It's clear that Plato was deeply enmeshed with the Dionysian regime, both father and son, especially the son, and that connection, that relationship had gotten him into terrible trouble and gotten Syracuse into even worse trouble. Now go back to the opening sentence that I started with, that there'll be no cessation from troubles for the human race until philosophers are rulers in the city. Well, Plato had a dream of saving the world by saving one man, by changing one man. That is, by educating a tyrant in a philosophic direction. It went miserably badly and provides a model for all of us in the dangers of tossing aside the flawed but still viable regime that in which one has lived, that is the democracy of Athens, and trying to move to some experimental model that may turn out to be much worse than what one had. So I'll leave it there, and we can pick up any of these issues in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rom, for telling us about some of Plato's problems in getting involved with real-world politics. Now for something slightly different, we have a panel discussion featuring three of our speakers, Professors James Rom, back again, Angie Hobbs, and Michael Fontaine. Thank you all for joining us. I'll be asking them questions inspired by some of your comments received here and via email. And so we'll start in a moment. Are we still waiting for Angie to join us? Maybe we can continue without her and see if we can get her online. But let's start with a question that builds a little more upon previous observations by some of our speakers. What else could be said about the main parallels between ancient Greece and the age in which we live? We live in the information age. So maybe people are thinking, well, surely this is completely different. You know, why should anyone care about the birth of democracy? You know, what could possibly be learnt from that? But then they start reading and hearing about it, and they think, oh, this is all sounding a little bit familiar, uncannily so. So I feel that some of our speakers might have some things that they want to add about the parallels between ancient Athens and the world in which we live. Who wants to begin?
I'll say a word. Yeah, there's a very famous sentence in Thucydides. I bet some people will know it. That basically the human beings, we don't change, right? I mean, so technology changes, but the things we want, the way we try and get them, those basically seem to be the same over and over and over. And so we have the point that impressed me the most, I thought I saw people talk about in the chat, is how we have similar rhetorical strategies to try and get stuff we want. We're all trying to influence each other. And it is remarkable how we all sort of resort to the same forms of rhetoric, the same loosey-goosey approach to language. You know, if you get caught, sort of stretching the truth, you can say, well, that's not really the way I meant the word. I meant the word in this other sense. And all around the world, all through history, we see people using the same thing. That, to me, I think is the key. But I'll leave it there.
Angie?
Oh, thank you. Yes. So the opening chapter of my new book is Plato and the Dialogue 4, because he shows that he models both healthy and unhealthy ways of engaging in dialogue and debate. And there good models of constructive, collaborative dialogue where everybody's working together to aim at the truth. And then there are really deliberately, he gives us bad models of sophists either seeking to bully and bludgeon their opponent into submission, or even more dangerously, deceive them through lots of verbal skullduggery and smoke and mirror tricks and things. And I think it's really, really important to recognize the ways, I said we need to be careful how we use words, but we also need to be alive to the good and bad ways other people use words. I am all for teaching, not just critical thinking and philosophy and skills. I would love to see some form of training. Rhetoric's too old-fashioned a word, but oral literacy, digital literacy, really, really important. We need to know what tricks are being used, and we need to pay attention to them, or we are going to be, sheep led to the slaughter.
We're told that we live in the information age, but, of course, in a sense, we live in the misinformation age. And I think that highlights the fact that we're still exposed to an enormous amount of rhetoric, which functions in a similar manner, like you've been saying. James, do you have anything else to add about parallels that you see between ancient Athens and the modern world that we're living in?
Yeah, Mike mentioned Thucydides, and he really is the best author to go to for a diagnosis of the ills of radical democracy. And his scenes in the assembly debates, in which emotion and rumor and misconceptions are governing the decisions of the demos. And Mike's whole book is about the difficulty of saying no. People are raising their hands to vote, and if they see a large majority raising their hand, the pressure not to do so is very strong. So in our current democracy, the influence of the social media and the Twitter sphere and the blogosphere, the amount of instantaneous reaction. This was the problem for the assembly, that reactions were instantaneous and highly emotional. And now, because of our interconnectedness, we're like one big assembly again, and the capacity for things to influence the impulsive decision making of the assembly is very strong.
Angie?
So even in the middle of the 17th century, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who I'm allegedly related to by as an ancestral relation, it's never been proved, but anyway, he says even in about 1650 that he doesn't think democracy will survive modern media. Now, he doesn't particularly care about that because he prefers a king, but what's his modern media? It was just the advent of the broadsheet, the political broadsheet. That's all it was. And even in 1650, he says democracies are simply going to be run by those with the largest megaphones and the deepest pockets. And think of how the media and social media has exploded since then. Now, my wish, which is a long way off from being fulfilled, is that social media platforms are subject to sort of editorial publication controls, that we're a long way off that. So we have to come at it from the other direction. We have to come at it from education from a very young age. I'm talking primary school. And to be fair, I think the kids are probably more digitally literate and aware than a lot of people of my kind of age. So I don't know what my fellow panelists think, but that's the only way to go at the moment until we can get some kind of legal control.
Does anyone want to respond?
Well, since you ask, I would take the totally opposite. I mean, it's fascinating what you say about
Hobbes. Oh, sorry. Okay.
But I myself go in completely the opposite direction. I'm First Amendment all the way. I think Europe has made a massive mistake in clamping down on speech. You don't have it to begin with, but it's getting worse, the illusion that you have it. So I don't think the truth will wash out that way. But we hear this phrase. We now have experts at Cornell and probably many universities, self-styled experts on misinformation. And so I say, how do you know? How do any of us know these things that we feel so morally certain about? Right. And this is one of the great lessons I take out of some of Plato's writings, not being, by the way, the Plato expert here. So you'll correct me, both of you, all three of you, actually. But all these claims are made about things happening in the world, things happened in the past, things happening in the stratosphere, getting hotter, and so on. How could the average person know what's real and what's not? And the misinformation experts we have here, they don't even take a basic course in epistemology, or they don't require it. So I say, well, I just don't know. So I cling to free speech. That's a Greek value too, by the way. So I'm hopeful it'll outlast Hobbes. I mean, we've done okay since Hobbes, I guess, if that was 17th century. But that's all I'll say on that one.
Okay, fair enough. We'll talk another time about free speech in Europe. I haven't noticed it being in trouble recently. Certainly not today. But I'll say no more. But just go online after this and have a look at social what's happening in the UK today.
Well, maybe we can look at the next question, which is, we all know, or we think we know, maybe this falls on nicely in some ways, like we think we know what a dictator looks like. But what are the subtle forms of tyranny that we face? And how can we defend our society against those? Like, do we really know dictatorship when we see it, or does it take more insidious forms? Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, the whole problem of, what to call people in the Greek world, I mean, nobody called themselves a tyrant. Dionysius invented a new title for himself, the Archon of Syracuse, which is a harmless word. It's like a government official, and it was meant to ruffle no feathers. And then some people called him a king, and a king is a good thing in many circles. So, yeah, they're easier to recognize in hindsight, I think, than in the present.
I mean, any other thoughts, Angie?
Well, I mean, this is a quote about fascism, but I think it can be used about authoritarianism more generally, that fascism doesn't always arrive in tanks. But I think, and that's true, and that's why it's so insidious. You sometimes don't realize that it's there until it's too late. But I think the point is that these bad forms of authoritarianism end up with at least the ability to use tanks. So it's when things tip over into the use of illegal or non-legal physical force and the corruption of legal systems and judicial systems. That's when you're in real trouble. But the questioner is quite right. That you might realize then, and then it's too late. And watching, and the trick is to spot the early signs. And quite a few of the talks today have been about helping people be alert to the early signs before you get to the tanks, before you get to the utter corruption of judicial and legal systems, before you get to, and Mike and I will certainly completely agree about the importance of freedom of expression. And I think Plato is absolutely right to say one of the early, and Thucydides, absolutely right to say one of the early signs to watch out for is the corruption of moral language and the subversion of terms and the banding around of use of words like freedom and democracy to mean whatever the heck you want them to mean. That's when it gets really dangerous. And then, of course, the banning of stuff that you don't like. I mean, Freud said that people who start out by burning books end up by burning people. So, yeah, words, books matter.
Maybe I can add something as well, that Plato said when the tyrant first appears, he presents himself as a protector of the people. And, it may be the case that I saw somebody talking recently in a debate about what they wanted was a benign dictator, a benign autocrat. They thought that was what the country needed. So maybe first, if you feel that you share the values of a tyrant, you perhaps don't see them as an oppressor or a tyrant. But of course, you might be mistaken about what their values are. They might change their behavior or their values, or once you've created or removed checks and balances that allow someone to exercise power more autocratically, they might be replaced by somebody else who has the opposing values. So you potentially create a precedent for somebody to come into power who you don't agree with. And so I think that might be one of the ways that authoritarianism can rise more insidiously, is when people believe that what they're putting into place is a benign dictator whose values they agree with. Michael.
If I could respond to that, there's an incipient idea in Plato. You see it in this dialogue, Crito. And I guess it doesn't, to my knowledge, it doesn't really get worked out till sort of the 19th century, but the idea of the tyranny of the majority, where you ask, what does it look like? Well, when the democracy itself becomes a tyranny against the minorities within it. Right? I mean, when you look around and you see people voting for things that you find appalling, or you see voting to restrict people's rights, restrict the franchise, do all kinds of terrible things that you think they shouldn't be doing, say, well, I didn't know you were a tyrant, or you're all. It's what you're saying. They say, "Well, I share these values." So that's where I would like to think that our codified civil liberties can put a stop to that kind of thing. Now, of course, if you have a very powerful individual, they just ride roughshod. I mean, we're seeing examples of that, many examples of that all around the world right now. So I don't know that I have a great prescription, but that seems like an idea worth thinking about more.
It's fascinating to think about it's fascinating to think about the Medicis of Florence. Lorenzo the Magnificent. Well, we call him the Magnificent. That's got to be good, right? But he really was a classic tyrant. He was manipulating the elections and robbing from the treasury and preserving one-man rule. So that's the ultimate challenge: is can you dismiss a person like Lorenzo from politics? Can you regard him as a tyrant and say, no, we can't have more of that?
Angie?
Yeah, so I think there's a philosophical angle on this. So I will controversially say that I support democracy, not because I think that the majority is always right. I mean, the majority is not factually always right, or the world would have been flat for all the years that it was round. The majority is not always morally right, or slavery would have been right for all the years that the majority endorsed it. For me, the philosophical grounding of democracy is not that the majority is always right, but that each individual person has a right to an individual voice and the dignity of an individual voice and being heard. Now, so if a democracy then votes to subdue the individual voice of everybody, and to get rid of the foundation of democracy and say, no, not every individual has a right to be heard, only those who agree with us. And then I think they have undermined the philosophical basis of democracy. And that form of democracy has tipped over into, what was the word that Plutarch used, Mike?
Oh, well, I was
when it's not democracy, but it's sort of basic thuggery,
You mean aquacracy?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think one can sort of say that form of democracy, when it is actually undermining its very basic philosophical basis of it, then you can resist that.
Well, Angie, you've led perfectly. You've led perfectly into the next question, I think, which is that democracy works quite well under certain conditions if the voters are all intelligent and well educated and well informed and rational agents. But it can struggle to function properly if the electorate are being deceived and manipulated and misinformed. This is something that we touched on a moment ago as well. How can democratic societies function effectively if there's an increase in propaganda and misinformation, or what could they do to combat that problem?
Well, they can't. They can't, and that's why democracies can destroy themselves from within. And this is why media and the social media at the moment is a real challenge. And that is why it behoves all of us as individuals in this kind of community where we care about these things to keep trying to call stuff out.
Well, thank you for turning it around, because when you said you can, I was going to say, but it's our, like, you guys are responsibility as intellectuals, public intellectuals in particular, have a role perhaps in helping the general public to see through misinformation and propaganda and political rhetoric to some extent. And to what extent did philosophy originate as a countermeasure to political oratory in the early days of the Athenian democracy, for example? Plato spends quite a lot of time pitting Socrates against the sophists. Can we see philosophy in some regards as a countermeasure against rhetoric?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a real world example here. So philosophy is supposed to be the antidote to rhetoric, but rhetoric wins every time. Here at Cornell, I run a lecture series called The Program on Freedom and Free Societies. It's a wonderful thing. We bring in people who are designed to spread light rather than heat and everything. Nobody wants it. But what do? When the students can bring in someone, they bring in the circus clowns, the people, the outrage merchants, the people that generate the sound clips, and they love it. They will pay all their money to hear the modern day sophists come in and jostle their emotions and give them the dopamine hits. Universities are supposed to counter this stuff, but I have a standing line. I say there's no money in truth. So I don't know how we're gonna fix that. I tried.
I'm going to push back against that, because I kind of half agree with you. Right? Yeah. There's definitely some truth in what you're saying, but at the same time, science and logic aren't dead, and there's a big demand. For example, on the internet, there are viral videos about logical fallacies, and where people analyze videos by popular debaters, let's say, without naming any names, and picking apart all the logical fallacies and what they're saying. So there's a thirst out there for critical thinking and help using philosophical tools to see through a rhetoric that's all over the internet. So there has to be also a competing drive that's out there somewhere. Okay. Angie, I think you wanted to.
Yes, I mean, so a little note of hope. I mean, I feel some of your despair, Mike, but not entirely. So my job title is Professor of the Public Understanding of Philosophy. I'm choosing to go freelance from September, but I'll be an emerita professor of the public understanding of philosophy then. And it's been hugely encouraging the last 30 years. I think Donald is right. There is an enormous thirst for people who don't, from people who don't just want quick fixes and easy answers and quick glib sound bites. I certainly don't see myself as an expert proclaiming truth to the people. I'm part of the public who wants to understand philosophy. So I'm here to learn just as much as to teach. I'm not Zarathustra on a mountaintop telling people how to live. So I actually think that culture is ahead of politics in this. And, if you just read media headlines, you'd think you'd be totally despair. And I'm slightly depressed about your experience at Cornell, but I've had different experiences at other universities. And no, I mean, the enormous appetite for the biggest mailbag I always get is when I talk about philosophy in the schools. And because I'm involved with various organizations, and I get a huge mailbag from teachers, parents, grandparents, and pupils who want books and they want courses and things. So my experience is more cheerful. It's more cheerful than yours. I haven't despaired yet. But it is a tough battle. It's a daily tough battle. I mean, but rhetoric doesn't have to be bad. Rhetoric and philosophy don't have to be opposed. Plato uses rhetoric all the time. The point is, it needs to be in the service of truth. Persuasive techniques are fine if they're in the service of truth. It's only if they're there to deceive or distract
And I think also I would add something to that, which is I think we have to be aware of them. I think even if rhetoric is used in the service of truth, but we're not fully aware of the effect it's having on us, then that might potentially be seen as a bad thing. But if it's kind of transparent to us and we understand how rhetoric is functioning and the shortcuts that it's taking and the way that it's affecting our emotions, then perhaps that gives us more freedom and more control over the way that we utilize it and respond to it. I just as an aside, and I want to say, because I think it's an important point to make, we tend to think of rhetoric as something that we do to other people. But my experience in cognitive therapy is that it's something we do to ourselves as well. Clients in cognitive therapy are constantly using rhetoric to make themselves depressed and anxious and angry about things, without properly realizing what it is that they're doing. So I think we're already stepping into the final question, and maybe in the spirit of hope that Angie has introduced. What are the practical steps? Well, it's kindling the flame of the lamp of hope. What practical steps can ordinary citizens like our audience watching today take to try and help democracy? And what's the role of philosophers and intellectuals, like our panelists, during times of democratic crisis?
Well, speaking for myself, all three of us are educators, and we educate adolescents or young adults, and we have an opportunity to help train them to see truth from lies. I think that's the best contribution that I can make. And
you're all authors.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, Mike.
Please go ahead, Angie. Please.
No, you go.
Well, I'll stick with what Plutarch recommends that I spoke about. I would like everybody to practice saying no in preparation for an improper request. If your grandma asks for help carrying her groceries, that you don't say no to that. You say yes. But if somebody asks you to bend the rules, or maybe a relative asks you to help them out in a way you wouldn't help somebody else out, those are the kind of things. Start practicing now, so that if people come around and they ask you to do something you're not comfortable with, you don't do it.
This is ancient assertiveness training. I can't help but mention that the Cynics also recommend making unreasonable requests in order to practice having them refused. Didn't Diogenes the Cynic say that he wanted a statue erected in his honor or something like that, so that he could practice having his requests refused?
Plutarch says he says the same thing in the thing I translated, that Diogenes went around begging of statues, so that when they didn't respond, he'd get used to being told no.
Yeah. So in modern assertiveness training, we get people to refuse unreasonable requests, to practice doing that, and also to practice making requests that they know are going to be declined, so that they learn to develop a thicker skin, basically, you might say. Angie, I think you were about to jump in.
Two really brief points. So one, we've got three academics, four academics, because you're an academic, Donald, in your psychotherapy on this panel, but we all write stuff outside our specific academic expertise. We write our academic articles and books, but we also write stuff for a wider public. So we've all tried to step up to that. The importance of saying no, but also sometimes the importance of saying yes. And I'll try and keep the political context out of this, but I was due to give a talk in a nearby town in the UK on a subject about I'll keep it about some stuff where I felt that a certain government in the UK was breaking certain laws. I'll keep it as general as that. And the organizers contacted me the day before, and they said they'd heard that a demonstration had been organized around the entrance to this place against me, and it might be quite hostile, and did I want to pull out? And I thought, well, heck, my dad fought in World War II for 6 years. I think I can cope with a hostile crowd. In the event, it poured with rain. I went, not a single protester turned up. And I thought, this was okay. Their protest did not cope with a heavy downburst of rain. So the courage to say no sometimes, and also sometimes the courage to say yes. In the event, I needed no courage at all. But
I think there's a lesson about resilience there. And I would like to thank you, our panelists, for your resilience and staying with us for this little extra slot after having done your presentations.
Thank you for organising this. It's been a delight, the whole thing. Thank you.
I think it's great, and I hope that, you know, it was an inspiring subject, I think, when it came up, and lots of people were asking us about it, and I know the audience are really excited about it, you know, and it's been a joy listening to the presentations today, and the variety of perspectives that we've had, I thought was fantastic, and I know that people in the chat have got a lot out of it. So thanks to all three of you again for staying with us. And now I think it's time to move on to our final presentation of today. To wrap things up, we have Robert Rosenkranz, the founder of the Open to Debate Foundation and the author of The Stoic Capitalist, which has just come out recently. In a time of cancel culture and ideological rigidity, his work champions the power of reasoned disagreement. Check out Open to Debate if you're interested. How do we resist mob mentality while preserving free discourse? What does Stoicism, for example, teach us about engaging with opposing views? Robert explores these ideas further in a special interview that was recorded exclusively for today's event, and you might recognize the interviewer. So without further ado, Robert Rosenkranz. Interview Robert Rosenkranz. Robert grew up in humble circumstances and built a major fortune as a pioneer in leveraged buyouts, hedge funds, and the insurance industry. He joins us to discuss his new book, The Stoic Capitalist, Advice for the Exceptionally Ambitious. Blending memoir with philosophical insight, the work explores how Stoic principles have shaped his career and his vision of a well-lived life, offering perspectives on ambition, virtue, and resilience that we'll delve into today. So, Robert, let's start at the beginning. You describe yourself as a natural-born Stoic. How have Stoic principles, such as focusing on what's within your control and what isn't, guided your decisions in life and in your career?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and your inputs were really valuable in helping me craft the book. But I did find in Stoic philosophy something that resonated with me extremely deeply because it was my natural mode of behavior. It was my natural way of responding. And in the book, I talk about some of the early childhood experiences I had where absolutely the obstacle was the way. Financial insecurity was the obstacle. Self-reliance was the way. Terrible ideas of Marxism and communism at home were the obstacle. Critical thinking was the way. An absence of role models in my world was the obstacle. Voracious reading of biographies was the way. So it really became, once I started to read Stoicism, and I realized that this was the way I was responding to childhood challenges, and it was a philosophy that helped me cope as a child and a philosophy that helped me succeed as an adult.
So what other ideas did you take from Stoicism? And I wondered if you had any thoughts about what the opposite attitude might be. In other words, where do you think people could potentially go wrong in terms of how they deal with challenges? What's an unhelpful attitude to adversity?
Well, I would say almost any statement in the form of she did that or he did that because is usually trouble. If you separate the fact of what happened with your interpretation, I think that's very important. I think people can get in big trouble in relationships by over-interpreting and what is heard, what they hear, and what it means, and not having the humility to step back and say, it's hard for me to figure out what's motivating me to do things, no less motivate other people. So that could be a source of real trouble, that cognitive distortion. Another thing very common is framing, where you have a kind of a preconceived notion about something, Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a situation, and there's all kinds of data coming in. And if you interpret ambivalent data to support your frame and ignore contrary data, that's a very bad habit and can lead to poor outcomes and poor judgments. So those would be, to me, examples of the kinds of non-stoic or anti-stoic attitudes. Another one is catastrophizing, rather than taking a realistic view of the consequences of an adverse outcome or an undesired outcome. Go immediately to the worst possible consequences. And that's another kind of cognitive mistake that can lead to pretty bad real world.
You also wrote in your book that the Stoics see anger as our most destructive emotion. It's a subject that I'm very, very interested in. So I wondered, can you share an example maybe from your own life of a time or situation when managing your anger or avoiding anger altogether was crucial for you?
Well, sure. I mean, I think what the Stoics certainly understand that you can get angry, and that angry is an absolutely natural human emotions. But what they're asking of us is that while getting angry is natural, that you should take that acting angry should be a conscious decision. And it's a decision you make after a little bit of reflection. And will acting angry in this circumstance serve my interests? Will it help achieve an outcome that I want? And stopping to answer that question, the answer is usually no. There's a story in my book, actually a chapter, where a major bank asked me to do a favor for them and buy a loan with the promise that they would buy it back if the loan got into trouble. And I did the favor. And the loan did get into trouble, and they wouldn't buy it back. And then I had an opportunity to refuse to consent to a change that they wanted to make. And I felt, I shouldn't have to own this damn thing in the first place. I'm not going to go along. The president of the bank comes to my office. He's this big ex-Princeton football player. And he basically threatens me that if I don't go along with this, my reputation is going to be compromised, not only with his bank, but with all the other big banks in the syndicate. I experienced the guy as a bully. I felt I had done them a favor. They had reneged on their promise. I was furious. But I gave myself this sort of strategic pause. I went to the men's room to think about it. I realized I would need to capitulate. And I developed the presence of mind to do it graciously, thank them for coming in, thank them for explaining what was at stake for the bank and agreeing to do it. And then I was gracious in defeat, but he was equally gracious in victory. He said to the last words he said as he left my office were, if you ever need a favor from this bank, come directly to me. So, he wasn't a bully. He was just pursuing his self-interests. And, once you realize that, your anger goes away and you just sort of figure what's the outcome here that's going to work for both of us. And I think we arrived at that outcome.
As you probably know, Seneca wrote a whole book on anger, and his favorite example of a man who learned to conquer his anger was Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire. And apparently, instead of counting to 10, Augustus used to recite the Greek alphabet to himself when he noticed that he was becoming angry in order to introduce a bit of a pause. I wanted to follow up by asking whether you feel that intense anger, such as moral outrage, which there's plenty of today, can sometimes prevent us from engaging in constructive political discourse, something that I know that's very close to your heart.
Yes, I definitely think it does. I feel like, and it's quite common today, particularly among progressives who are utterly dismayed by the Trump administration in the United States, that they're so angry that it's almost impossible to have a reasoned discussion. And I think our politics in general has gotten very angry. And it makes it very difficult for people to appreciate the nuances of situations, the complexity of policy choices. And so, yes, I would definitely agree that anger is a huge obstacle to sensible discourse.
You also wrote in your book that having lived through a hard-fought Revolutionary War, America's founding fathers were fearful of the tyranny of the king, but they were equally fearful of the tyranny of the mob. So I wondered, what form do you think tyranny takes today, potentially, and how can we prevent its rise?
Well, I think I think there are certain behaviors that we're seeing in the White House today that certainly critics could call tyrannical. There's an element of capriciousness. There's an element of excessive exercise of authority, and kind of expressed skepticism about legal norms. But the U.S. constitutional construct really put two big constraints. There are two big ways of addressing this in our construct, and one is the courts. And it's a very apt question today, because the headline in the Wall Street Journal today is "Court Strikes Down Trump Tariffs." The whole rationale that he had was a kind of a very slender national security kind of argument, and the courts just struck it down. So we have a system where the courts can say no to the executive, and that's binding. The other thing is that Congress has delegated a lot of authority to the president under various kind of emergency powers acts. They can change that. If they get their act together, they can reduce presidential power and assert more powers that they're supposed to assert. The United States Senate has the role of advising and consenting on presidential nominations. It kind of abdicated that role, but it's the founders really created a very good mechanism to be sure that the executive in America does not operate like a tyrant.
Now, your chapter called Too Much Democracy also discusses political polarization. So, in your view, what's going wrong in the world? What are the main threats to modern democracy?
Well, I talk about this in the book, and a lot of it is somewhat well-intentioned. The sort of irony is that a lot of the problems that we have, certainly in the United States, where I have some expertise and have been a close observer, were pretty well intentioned. So, as an example, when I was a young adult, political candidates were selected by the parties in smoke-filled rooms, and those rooms were political pros picking people that they knew personally to run for office. It was not transparent. It was not democratic, but they were picking people that they thought were reasonably qualified. You then have primaries, direct selection of the candidates by party members. Well, the only members that show up to vote in the primaries are the extremes on the right and the extremes on the left. You then have gerrymandering, which is that the congressional districts the lines have been drawn so that 90% of those districts are safe for one party or another. So the only voices that count, the only election that counts is the primaries. The only people who are voting are people on the extreme, And the center is consigned to political homelessness. That's sort of one development, well-intentioned. Another well-intentioned development was campaign finance reform. You can't give more than, I think, about $2,900 to a political campaign. Well, if a political campaign costs $100 million to run for Senate in a big state in the United States, and you've got to pick that up in $2,900 pieces, you've got to get thousands and thousands of people to write checks. Well, the way you do that is you stoke their fear, you stoke their anger. The Republicans talk about taking away your gun rights or waves of illegal immigrants. The Democrats talk about taking away your abortion rights or despoiling the planet. So the political messaging to get people angry enough to write the checks is all about anger and fear. If I went to run for office and said, I'm in favor of a sensible compromise to produce better outcomes in government, you think anybody's going to write a check for me? I don't believe it. So that's another one, and that's sort of structured. Another thing that's happened, which sounds on the face of it pretty good, is the fragmentation of media. So again, when I was a young person or young adult, there were 3 television networks in the United States. And if you owned one of them, your incentive was cast as, attract as big an audience as you can, offend as few people as you can. And that meant they were all sort of generally centrist. Changes to 30 news channels sounds much more open and quote, democratic, but then the incentive, if you're an owner, is very different. Then your incentive is to get a very strong emotional bond with a small group of viewers. So Fox, for example, really does that strategy better than anybody else and is by far the most profitable of the news outlets. So this is not a result of evil ideas. This is just kind of coming about by changes, some of which are driven by technology, some of which are driven by well-intentioned political interventions.
So, Robert, what can we do about it? How can we address these problems? And in particular, how can we get back to being able to have civil discourse and encourage more tolerance of disagreement?
I think one of the best ways of doing it is debate. And it's, as you know, I've been the founder and chief, biggest funder, I'd say, of Open to Debate, which I think is pretty widely regarded as the gold standard of debate in America. Weekly podcast, it's on prime time on many NPR stations around the country. We have live events, we have a YouTube channel and so forth. And we've tried to create in the public square a contempt-free zone where ideas will trump ideology, where facts will trump emotion, and where the audience will listen with some degree of open-mindedness to the views of both sides. Now, admittedly, it's a self-selected audience, but it's a growing audience, and there seems to be more and more of an appetite. One example I'm particularly proud of is we did a debate on the resolution, Israel's actions in Gaza were justified. And that's a hugely emotionally charged issue on many campuses today. We had over 25 million engagements. I don't know if people changed their minds particularly, but they certainly began to understand the moral imperatives or moral sentiments on the other side. And so that was, I think, quite interesting. We've done, in live debates, we frequently would have the audience vote, and they would vote before even being introduced to the debaters and then afterwards. And 25% of the people who came in with an opinion changed their minds because of debate. And of the people who didn't, when I spoke to them, they would frequently say, well, I voted the same way twice, but there are facts on the other side that I hadn't considered, or arguments on the other side, or moral sentiments on the other side. So debate becomes a very useful tool for addressing this kind of polarization that you've referenced.
I wonder also if, in some ways, and I wonder if you've ever thought about it from this point of view, that open to debate perhaps embodies some of the values that we find advocated by Stoic philosophy, such as Stoicism advocates for reason and temperance. And I wondered, I guess, also what you think are the ingredients that go towards making a healthy civil debate.
Well, in my case, open to debate really almost fulfilled a young or almost childhood dream of, or vision, I'd say, of philanthropy as part of a well-lived life. But my sense of philanthropy was not giving money away. It was using one's talents and abilities to bring into being the institutions that you felt the society needed. And my biographical examples of that were Carnegie with the libraries, the public libraries, and the Carnegie Hall and Carnegie Mellon and the Carnegie Institute for Peace, or Rockefeller with Rockefeller University, University of Chicago. So these people were and I was striving to find some place in my own life where I could actually bring something to bear, something into being that I felt the society needed. So the open to debate was a great example of that for me. And there's a chapter in the book called The Selfish Philanthropist. And I got a great deal of personal satisfaction and very much enjoyed the process of sort of honing this organization and helping shape what makes a good debate. And I think that was sort of the earlier part of your question. I think what you need, first of all, is a topic where there are two intellectually valid positions. You need a topic, I think it should be a topic where the outcome matters to people. Ideally, it would be something where people are open-minded enough to change their minds. Things could matter because it affects you personally, or it could matter because it's an important, it's an issue that you feel strongly about, or it could matter because it's a public issue, public policy issue of some real consequence. So those are all elements to a good debate. The formulation I like best is where you ask, should a specific actor do something? Congress should leave abortion to the states, yes or no? That kind of thing, where you know who you're talking about and what you're asking whether they should or shouldn't do. A debate about moral sentiments is a little squishier. A debate about the future, again, a little squishier. A debate about something factual, like cops are racist. That's a good debate because there's a lot of data that could be brought forth on both sides of it.
My sense is that there's some kind of connection between being open to debate and being a better citizen. And we've touched on some of the problems that are caused by intolerance of disagreement and anger and so on. I wondered how else you think ancient philosophies, like Stoicism in particular, might help us to become better citizens today.
Well, I think the biggest element, I think, is privileging reason over emotion. this idea that reason is our highest attribute, and we should use reason to regulate emotion. So when you approach politics, political issues, public issues with a high degree of emotion, you're not acting as a stoic and you're not doing your best as a citizen. These issues are contentious because they're complicated, because there are nuances, because there are moral arguments on both sides. And to develop the stoic distance or the stoic respect for reason is helping you as a citizen to approach these issues in a way that is much more constructive than simply an emotional reaction to one side or another.
That was my final question. So I'd like to say thanks very much, Robert, for joining us today. I'm sure our audience enjoyed what you had to say. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and good luck with the Stoic Capitalist as well. I know it's already been doing very well, and I'm sure our audience today will want to check it out too.
Well, it was a pleasure being on the program, and thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, so we've arrived at the end. Today, we've traversed ancient crises and modern challenges, from Plato's dire warnings about tyranny, to Plutarch's strategies, proto-assertiveness training, from civic decay to the courage needed to rebuild. Democracy isn't self-sustaining. It demands vigilance, wisdom, and participation. Thank you to our incredible speakers, all of them, and to all of you for engaging in this vital conversation today. The work continues beyond today. Let's carry these lessons forward. Thanks to all of our speakers, and thanks again to our 3 panelists. Thanks to you, our audience, for taking part in the chat and for joining us. And thank you once again to our crew, Jeff and Casey, for all of their help today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Remember, we've got that philosophy of love and relationships event that you can register now for and support the work of Plato's Academy Centre. Goodbye, everybody. And thank you once again.